The eviction notice arrived on a Tuesday, which Clara Dawson would later think was fitting because Tuesdays had always been the cruelest days of her week. Not Mondays, which at least carried the momentum of dread everyone shared, and not Wednesdays, which offered the faint promise of a downhill slide toward the weekend. Tuesdays were the days when the world reminded you that your suffering wasn't dramatic enough to be interesting, just relentless enough to grind you down 1 millimeter at a time until you forgot what standing straight felt like. She held the paper in both hands, reading it twice because the first time the words refused to arrange themselves into meaning. 30 days to vacate. Past due balance of $4,200. Legal proceedings will commence. The language was sterile and efficient, designed to reduce a family's displacement to administrative procedure. Behind her, the kitchen faucet dripped its steady metronome, each drop landing in a pot she'd placed in the sink 3 weeks ago when the landlord stopped returning calls about the leak. Jonah appeared in the doorway first. 12 years old, already taller than Clara by nearly 2 inches, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. He'd been doing homework at the kitchen table, geometry problems that he attacked with the focused aggression of someone who believed that understanding angles and theorems might somehow build a foundation the adults in his life kept failing to provide. He saw the paper in her hands and didn't ask what it was. He'd learned to read disaster on his mother's face the way sailors read weather, not from the obvious signs, but from the subtle shifts that preceded the storm. How long? His voice carried no panic, just the flat practicality of a boy who'd been through enough transitions to know that the first question always mattered more than the emotional reaction. Clara folded the notice and slid it into her back pocket. 30 days. Okay. Jonah returned to his geometry without another word, pencil moving across paper with renewed intensity, as though solving for X might somehow solve for everything else. Willa was harder. 8 years old with copper hair that tangled no matter how carefully Clara braided it each morning, and a sensitivity to emotional atmospheres that made her a barometer for every storm Clara tried to hide. She sat cross-legged on the living room floor surrounded by library books, reading 3 simultaneously the way she always did, flipping between them as if each contained a piece of a larger story only she could assemble. When Clara knelt beside her, Willa looked up with eyes that already knew. We're moving again, aren't we? Clara pulled her daughter close, smelling the apple shampoo she bought in bulk from the dollar store, because Willa said it made her hair feel like an orchard. Maybe, but we'll figure it out. We always do. Willa's small hand found Clara's. Mom, are we ever going to stop figuring it out and just be somewhere? The question lodged in Clara's chest like a splinter she couldn't reach. She kissed the top of her daughter's head and said nothing, because every answer she could think of was either a lie or too honest for an 8-year-old to carry. Clara Dawson had been figuring it out for 6 years, ever since Derek walked out of their apartment in Knoxville with a duffel bag and a sentence that still echoed in her worst moments. I didn't sign up for this much hard. The this much hard had been Willa's colic that lasted 11 months, Jonah's dyslexia diagnosis that required tutoring they couldn't afford, a transmission that died on the interstate at rush hour, and the accumulated weight of 2 people trying to build a life on wages that never quite covered the architecture of survival. Derek's departure had been the first domino. Without his income from the warehouse, Clara couldn't cover rent alone on her salary from the veterinary clinic where she worked as a technician. She'd taken a second job waitressing at a diner that smelled permanently of bacon grease and broken dreams, leaving the kids with Mrs. Yamamoto next door, who refused payment but accepted casseroles and the occasional bottle of wine Clara bought with tip money she should have saved. Then Mrs. Yamamoto moved to Portland to be near her grandchildren, and the childcare arrangement collapsed, and the diner cut Clara's hours because she couldn't work the late shift anymore, and the dominoes kept falling in that particular pattern poverty arranges where each solution creates 2 new problems. They'd moved 4 times in 6 years. Knoxville to Chattanooga when Clara's cousin offered a spare room that turned out to be a garden shed with extension cord electricity. Chattanooga to a small town called Darby when Clara found work at a cattle ranch that provided housing, until the ranch sold to developers who had no use for a vet tech with 2 children and a 12-year-old sedan that burned oil like it was trying to send smoke signals. Darby to Meadowfield, where they'd landed in the apartment with the dripping faucet and the landlord who'd seemed kind until the rent fell behind and kindness evaporated like dew on asphalt. Now it was March, and Tennessee was caught between seasons, too cold for spring and too restless for winter. Clara sat at the kitchen table after the kids were asleep, calculator open on her phone, running numbers she already knew wouldn't work. Vet clinic paid $16.50 an hour, 32 hours a week, because they'd cut her to part-time when the practice consolidated. That was roughly $2,000 a month after taxes. Weekend cleaning work added another $600 if she picked up enough houses. Total income $2,600 against expenses that demanded $3,400 minimum. The deficit wasn't dramatic. It was $800, the kind of gap that felt crossable until you realized you'd been trying to cross it for years, and it only grew wider. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Area code she didn't recognize. She let it go to voicemail, assuming debt collector or scam, the twin pillars of communication that poverty attracted. But the message, when she played it back, was neither. Mrs. Dawson, this is Harold Finch from Finch & Associates in Dalton, Georgia. I'm attempting to reach you regarding the estate of Opal Dawson, your late grandmother. There are matters requiring your attention regarding property she's left to you. Please return this call at your earliest convenience. Clara played the message twice more, each time catching something new in the lawyer's tone. Not urgent exactly, but weighted with information he wasn't willing to leave on a recording. She hadn't spoken to her grandmother in over 3 years, and even then the conversation had been brief. A birthday call where Opal's voice carried the particular sharpness of a woman who had opinions about how Clara was living and the restraint not to voice all of them. Opal Dawson had been a surveyor's daughter who married a surveyor's son, and spent 63 years on a piece of land in rural northwest Georgia that nobody wanted and everybody had opinions about. Clara remembered childhood visits, driving down with her mother on summer weekends, the road narrowing from highway to county road to gravel to dirt, each transition stripping away another layer of the modern world until they arrived at a place that felt less like property and more like a statement about what happened when someone refused to leave. The land itself was 240 acres of mixed terrain, rolling hills covered in scrub pine and wild blackberry, bisected by a creek that dried to a trickle every August, bordered on 3 sides by timber company holdings and on the 4th by a county road that the maintenance crews serviced only when they remembered it existed. The house was a 3-bedroom farmhouse that Opal maintained with fierce independence and diminishing resources, painting the same boards every 5 years, replacing roof shingles one at a time, keeping a garden that fed her through winters that rural Georgia pretended didn't get cold. But the defining feature of Opal's property, the thing everyone mentioned when they talked about the old Dawson place, was the fence. Miles of it. Cedar posts driven into the earth with the precision of someone who understood that boundaries weren't suggestions, but declarations. The posts themselves were ancient, some dating back to the original homestead in the 1890s, darkened by weather and time to the color of charcoal, standing in lines that crossed the property at angles that didn't always correspond to modern survey maps. Corner posts were thicker, marked with notches that Opal's father had carved and Opal had maintained, checking each one annually with the devotion of a priest tending stations of the cross. People in the county thought Opal was eccentric at best, deteriorating at worst. An old woman walking her fence line with a notebook and a compass, talking to posts like they could hear her, refusing to sell despite offers from the Whitfield Timber Company that had grown increasingly generous over the decades. The Whitfields owned everything around her, 37,000 acres of managed pine forest that generated millions in timber revenue, and Opal's 240 acres sat in the middle of their holdings like a splinter they couldn't extract. Clara called Harold Finch the next morning from the parking lot of the vet clinic, sitting in her car with the engine running because the heater was the only reliable warmth in her life. Your grandmother passed 3 weeks ago. Harold's voice carried the practiced gentleness of someone who delivered bad news professionally. I'm sorry for your loss. Clara felt guilt before grief, the particular shame of learning about a death too late to have prevented the distance that preceded it. How? Peacefully. In her sleep. Neighbors found her when she didn't pick up her weekly grocery order. She left a will, Mrs. Dawson, and you're the sole beneficiary. Clara's hand tightened on the phone. What did she leave? The property. House, land, all contents. 240 acres, structures, and I'm quoting directly here, every post, every marker, every cornerstone, and everything they stand for. Clara almost laughed at the specificity. That sounded like Opal, a woman who measured her words with the same precision she measured property lines. What's it worth? Harold's pause told her before his words did. The county assessment is quite low. The house needs significant repair, the land hasn't been commercially managed, and frankly, the Whitfield Timber Company has expressed interest in purchasing it. Their initial offer is $12,000 for the entire parcel. $12,000 for 240 acres. Clara did the math automatically, the way poverty trained you to convert everything into survival time. $12,000 was 3.5 months of rent, maybe 4 if she found somewhere cheaper. It was a used car that might last 2 years. It was breathing room, not a solution, and definitely not a future. There's a condition. Harold's voice shifted slightly. Your grandmother's will specifies that you must live on the property for 6 months before you can sell. She was quite specific about this requirement. She also left a letter for you, sealed, with instructions that it be delivered only after you've spent your first night in the house. Of course she did. Clara pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. Even from the grave, Opal Dawson had opinions about how things should be done. The decision to move wasn't really a decision. It was arithmetic. 30 days until eviction, no security deposit for a new apartment, no family willing or able to help, and a free house waiting in Georgia. Even if free came with conditions and a 6-month sentence on land that smelled like pine sap and stubbornness. Clara told the kids on a Thursday evening, sitting on the apartment floor because they'd already sold the kitchen table to cover a utility bill. She'd cooked spaghetti on the stove, the cheap pasta and Jared sauce that constituted their dietary bedrock, and served it on paper plates because the real ones were packed. We're going to live at Great-Grandma Opal's house. Clara kept her voice steady, presenting it as adventure rather than last resort. In Georgia, there's land, a creek, space to explore. Jonah's expression calculated rather than reacted. Is there a school? There's a town about 20 minutes away. I'll make sure you're enrolled before we get there. Willa looked up from her pasta, sauce on her chin. Did Great-Grandma Opal die? Clara nodded, watching her daughter process information that children shouldn't have to process so often. Yes, sweetheart. A few weeks ago, she left us her house. Was she nice? Clara thought about Opal, trying to distill 60 years of complicated womanhood into something an 8-year-old could hold. She was honest. She worked harder than anyone I ever knew. She loved her land the way some people love their children, completely and without apology. Willa considered this. Did she love us too? In her way. Yes. Jonah asked the question Clara had been dreading. What's wrong with it? The house, the land, whatever she left. There's always something wrong. Clara looked at her son, 12 years old and already fluent in the language of disappointment, and felt something crack in her chest that she couldn't afford to let break completely. It needs work. The house is old, the land is overgrown, and apparently the main feature of the property is a bunch of old fence posts that everyone thinks are worthless. Jonah's mouth twisted. Fence posts. That's what we're inheriting. Fence posts. And 240 acres. Clara's voice carried a firmness she didn't entirely feel. That's more than most people ever get, Jonah. We're not in a position to be picky. The drive from Tennessee to northwest Georgia took 7 hours in Clara's sedan, which was 11 years old, and communicated its displeasure through a symphony of rattles, grinding sounds, and a check engine light that had been illuminated so long Clara considered it a design feature rather than a warning. The trunk held everything they owned, which wasn't much. Clothes in garbage bags because suitcases cost money. Books in cardboard boxes that Willa refused to leave behind. Jonah's geometry set and the soccer ball he'd gotten for Christmas 2 years ago, the surface worn smooth from being kicked against apartment walls when outdoor space wasn't available. They crossed into Georgia in late afternoon, the landscape shifting from Tennessee's rolling hills to the red clay and pine forests of the northwest corner. Clara followed GPS directions that grew increasingly uncertain as paved roads gave way to gravel and gravel gave way to dirt. Cell service disappeared around the same time as the pavement, which felt like a metaphor she didn't want to examine too closely. The Dawson property announced itself through absence rather than presence. The timber company land on either side was organized, managed rows of pines standing at attention like soldiers, understory cleared, access roads maintained. Then suddenly the order stopped and wildness began. Scrub oak and blackberry brambles crowded the roadside. Unmanaged pines grew at defiant angles. The fence appeared first, cedar posts emerging from the undergrowth like sentinels who'd held their position long after the army retreated. Dark with age, some leaning but none fallen, they marched along the property line with the stubborn verticality of objects that had been placed with purpose and refused to abandon it. Willa pressed her face against the car window. There are so many of them. They're just fence posts. Jonah's dismissal carried the weight of a boy protecting himself from hoping something might be good. The house waited at the end of a quarter-mile driveway that was more suggestion than road, ruts filled with red clay water, overhanging branches scratching the car's roof like fingers testing whether the visitors were real. When the trees opened, the structure appeared with the sudden completeness of something that had been hiding and decided to reveal itself. It was smaller than Clara remembered, or maybe she'd grown larger in the ways that adulthood expands your frame of reference. White clapboard siding that had grayed to the color of old bone. A covered porch that stretched across the front, its roof supported by posts that matched the fence line markers. 2 brick chimneys, one at each end, standing like bookends holding the structure together. Windows dark and reflective, giving nothing away. The front yard had been taken over by wild grass and dandelions, but beneath the chaos Clara could see the ghost of Opal's garden, raised beds built from stone, paths laid with flat creek rocks, the skeleton of a trellis that had once supported climbing roses. It looks like it's sleeping. Willa's voice carried wonder rather than fear. It looks like it needs about $50,000 in repairs. Jonah's assessment was probably accurate. Clara killed the engine. The silence that followed was so complete it felt like a physical substance, thick and textured, broken only by bird calls and the distant sound of wind moving through pine needles. She sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, staring at the house where her grandmother had lived and died alone, and felt the weight of inheritance settle onto her shoulders like a coat she hadn't asked to wear but couldn't refuse. They entered through the front door, which was unlocked because Opal had never believed in locks. The air inside was cold and still, carrying the particular smell of a house that had been breathing without human occupancy. Dust, wood polish, dried herbs hanging from kitchen rafters, and something deeper, the accumulated scent of decades of living that no amount of vacancy could fully erase. The interior was sparse, but not empty. Furniture that Opal had built or bought before Clara was born occupied rooms with the permanence of geological features. A cast-iron wood stove dominated the living room, its pipe rising through the ceiling like a raised fist. The kitchen held a gas range that probably predated the moon landing, a refrigerator that hummed with surprising vigor when Clara plugged it in, and a table made from a single slab of walnut that must have taken 4 men to carry through the door. Willa explored with the systematic curiosity of a child who'd learned that new spaces needed to be cataloged before they could become safe. She opened every cabinet, every drawer, every closet, reporting her findings to Clara with the precision of an inventory specialist. "There's flour in here, Mom. And canned peaches. A lot of canned peaches. Blankets that smell like cedar. A whole room full of maps." Jonah focused on practical assessment. "The roof leaks in the back bedroom. There's a crack in the foundation on the south wall. The water pump makes a weird noise, but it works." He paused in the hallway, studying a photograph hanging on the wall. A black and white image showing Opal as a young woman, maybe 30, standing beside a fence post with her hand resting on its top, looking directly at the camera with an expression that mixed defiance with something Clara could only describe as knowing. She looked like she was guarding something. Clara joined him, studying the photograph. She guarded this land her whole life. From what? Clara didn't have an answer, not yet, but the question planted itself in her mind and began to grow roots. The neighbors arrived before Clara had finished unpacking the car. Gerald Whitfield drove up in a truck that cost more than Clara would earn in 2 years, tires crunching gravel with the confidence of someone who considered every road in the county his personal driveway. He was 62, silver-haired, with the kind of tan that came from golf courses rather than field work. His family had owned the timber company for 3 generations, building an empire of managed pine forests that stretched across 4 counties and generated revenue measured in the tens of millions. Beside him sat his son, Travis, mid-30s, whose face carried the particular expression of someone who'd inherited enough to be comfortable and not enough responsibility to be interesting. He wore a polo shirt with the Whitfield Timber logo embroidered on the chest, advertising ownership the way some people advertise personality. Gerald stepped out of the truck with the careful movements of a man whose doctor had recently discussed his knees. His smile was practiced, warm enough to seem genuine if you weren't looking carefully, cool enough to serve as warning if you were. "You must be Clara. I'm Gerald Whitfield. Your grandmother and I were neighbors for many years." He extended his hand, and Clara shook it, noting the softness of his palm against her calloused fingers. "This is my son Travis. We wanted to welcome you and see if there's anything you need." Clara recognized the visit for what it was. Not welcome wagon, but reconnaissance. Information gathering disguised as Southern hospitality, the kind of courtesy that came with strings so thin you didn't notice them until you were already tangled. "Thank you. That's kind. We're just getting settled." Travis wandered toward the fence line while his father talked, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the property with the appraising gaze of someone calculating board feet and acreage value. When he returned, he spoke to his father rather than Clara. "Posts are still standing. Every single one. Unbelievable." Gerald's smile tightened fractionally. "Your grandmother was devoted to those posts. We offered many times to help her replace them with modern fencing, wire and steel, much more practical. She always declined." Clara watched Travis measuring distances with his eyes, counting posts, mapping the fence line that separated Dawson land from Whitfield Holdings. "They're not just fence posts to the family." Gerald's expression shifted, something calculating moving behind the neighborly facade. "Of course not. But practically speaking, cedar posts don't generate income. That's 240 acres of prime timberland sitting unmanaged. Your grandmother left millions of dollars in potential revenue just standing there, growing wild." He let the number hang in the air, watching Clara's face for the reaction poverty would predictably produce. Millions. The word designed to make 12,000 seem reasonable if it came with the relief of someone else handling the burden. "We've made an offer through the estate attorney." Gerald's voice softened into the tone of someone presenting charity as business. 12,000 for the property, which I think you'll find is more than fair given the condition of the house and the lack of improvements. We'd take possession immediately, handle all the clearing and management ourselves. You could use that money to get your family established somewhere more suitable. More suitable. Clara heard the judgment buried in the suggestion. A single mother with 2 children and a dying car didn't belong on 240 acres of rural Georgia land. She belonged in an apartment somewhere, contained and manageable, taking the money and being grateful for it. Jonah had been listening from the porch, geometry textbook closed on his lap. 12,000 for 240 acres. He spoke without looking up. That's $50 an acre. Market rate for unimproved timberland in this county is between $800 and $2,000 per acre. Gerald's head turned toward the boy with the sharp precision of surprise. Clara saw Travis's jaw tighten. Jonah met Gerald's gaze with the steady calm of someone who'd done the math and trusted it completely. "Even at the low end, this property is worth $192,000. Your offer is 6% of minimum market value." The silence that followed was the particular kind that occurs when power encounters unexpected resistance. Gerald recovered quickly, his smile reassembling itself into something more cautious. "Smart boy." He looked at Clara with reassessment in his eyes. "Well, the offer stands. No pressure, no timeline. We're just glad to have neighbors again." He paused at his truck door, turning back with an afterthought that felt rehearsed. "Though I should mention, the county has been discussing road maintenance for this stretch. Access could become an issue if the property isn't actively managed. Just something to be aware of." The threat was elegant in its indirection. "Nice access road you have here. Shame if something happened to it." Clara watched the Whitfield truck disappear down the driveway and felt the particular exhaustion of being poor in proximity to wealth. $12,000. It would solve everything immediately and nothing permanently, which was exactly how exploitative offers were designed to work. Inside, Willa had found the room full of maps. She sat cross-legged on the floor surrounded by papers spread in a semicircle around her, studying them with the focused absorption she usually reserved for library books. "These are really old, Mom. Some of them have dates from like the 1800s. Clara knelt beside her daughter, examining the documents. Survey maps, hand-drawn with the meticulous detail of a time when measurement required physical presence rather than satellite imagery. Property lines marked in ink that had faded from black to sepia. Corner markers noted with small circles and alphanumeric codes. Each map bore a date and signature, most reading E. Dawson, Clara's great-great-grandfather, Ezekiel, who'd been the original surveyor. But it was Opal's additions that caught Clara's attention. In red ink, newer than the original drawings but still faded with age, Opal had annotated the maps with notes. Measurements that didn't match the county records. Boundary lines that extended further than the current property deed indicated. Corner markers identified by codes that corresponded to nothing in the official surveys. And in the margins, the same phrase repeated in Opal's angular handwriting, over and over, like a prayer or a warning. The posts remember what the papers forgot. That night, after the kids were asleep in bedrooms that smelled like cedar and old quilts, Clara walked the porch in darkness. The fence posts were barely visible, darker shapes against the dark tree line. But she could feel them the way you feel the presence of something that's been watching you long enough to become patient. Harold Finch had mentioned a letter to be delivered after her first night in the house. She'd found it on the kitchen table when they'd arrived, a sealed envelope with her name written in Opal's handwriting, propped against a mason jar filled with dried wildflowers. She'd been saving it, the way you save the last bite of something good, knowing that once consumed it would be gone. She opened it now, sitting in Opal's rocking chair on the porch, reading by the light of her phone because the porch fixture had burned out years ago. Dear Clara, I know you think I was crazy. Everyone did. The old woman walking her fence line, talking to posts, refusing to sell land she couldn't properly manage. I accept that judgment because the truth required patience I didn't always have and explanations I couldn't safely give while certain people were still watching. But you're here now, which means the waiting is over. Those fence posts aren't just markers, Clara. They're evidence. Every one of them was placed by your great-great-grandfather Ezekiel Dawson in 1893, and every one of them tells a story that the Whitfield family has spent 4 generations trying to erase. Ezekiel was the finest surveyor in northwest Georgia. He was hired by the original Land Grant Commission to survey and mark 17,000 acres of public land for homestead distribution. He did his job with precision that bordered on obsession, driving corner markers and line posts with measurements. So exact that modern GPS confirms them to within inches. But 17,000 acres of prime timber land was worth a fortune even then. Judge Harlan Whitfield, Gerald's great-grandfather, wanted it for himself. He couldn't buy it legally because the land was designated for homestead distribution to 31 families. So he bought the county clerk instead, paid him to alter the survey records, reducing each homestead claim by between 40 and 60%, and reassigning the surplus acreage to Whitfield Holdings through falsified deeds. Ezekiel discovered the fraud when he walked his lines and found that the official records no longer matched his original markers. He reported it to the State Land Commission, but Judge Whitfield had connections there too. Ezekiel was discredited, accused of surveying errors, and stripped of his license. He spent the rest of his life maintaining those posts because they were the only evidence that survived. The original survey documents were destroyed in a convenient courthouse fire in 1901. The county clerk died under suspicious circumstances in 1903. The 31 families who'd been cheated didn't have the resources or knowledge to fight a judge who controlled the legal system. But the posts remained. Cedar lasts centuries if it's properly maintained. And Ezekiel taught his children to maintain them. And they taught their children, and your grandmother has walked that fence line every week for 63 years because those posts are the last surviving proof of the original survey. The land the Whitfields claim as their own, all 37,000 acres of managed timber, includes approximately 14,000 acres that were stolen from those 31 homestead families through forged documents and judicial corruption. The fence posts on our property don't just mark our boundaries. They mark the original survey grid for the entire district. And beneath each corner marker, Ezekiel buried something the Whitfields never found. Dig up the first corner marker, Clara, the one at the northwest point of the property, the tallest post with the deepest notches. You'll understand everything when you see what's underneath. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you this while I was alive. The Whitfields have been watching me for decades, waiting for me to make a mistake, to say something they could use to discredit me or seize the property. I had to appear crazy because crazy was safer than credible. You're not crazy, Clara. You're a Dawson. And Dawsons don't let thieves sleep easy. Walk the lines. Dig the markers. Finish what Ezekiel started. All my love, Grandma Opal P.S. Don't trust anyone who offers to buy the posts. They know what they're standing on, even if they pretend they don't. Clara read the letter 3 times, each pass revealing layers she'd missed in the previous reading. The porch creaked softly beneath the rocking chair, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the fence line, an owl called with the patience of a creature that understood waiting. She thought about Opal walking those lines in all weather, maintaining posts that everyone dismissed as an old woman's obsession, keeping evidence alive through the simple act of refusing to let it rot. She thought about Ezekiel driving stakes into Georgia clay with the precision of a man who knew that truth could be buried but not destroyed, that somewhere between the earth and the wood, justice was waiting for someone with the courage and the need to dig it up. She thought about $12,000 and Gerald Whitfield's soft hands and Travis counting posts like he was inventorying assets he already considered his own. And she thought about her children sleeping inside a house that smelled like cedar and survival, dreaming whatever dreams children dream when the waking world offers them fence posts and red clay, and a mother who keeps promising that this time, this place, things would be different. Clara folded the letter carefully, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it in her jacket pocket, close to her heart. Tomorrow she would find a shovel. Tomorrow she would walk to the northwest corner of the property, to the tallest post with the deepest notches, and she would dig. But tonight she sat on Opal's porch in Opal's chair, surrounded by Opal's fence posts, and let herself feel something she hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, that seemed premature, but possibility. The faint, dangerous, irresistible suggestion that maybe this time the inheritance wasn't just another version of nothing dressed up in legal language and tied with a bow of obligation. Maybe this time, the crazy old woman had been the sanest person in the county. And maybe, just maybe, the fence posts remembered everything. Morning arrived with the particular intensity of rural Georgia in early spring. Light that felt unfiltered, sounds that carried farther than they should have, air that smelled like pine resin and warming earth, and the faintest suggestion of rain that might come or might just threaten. Clara woke on the couch where she'd fallen asleep after coming in from the porch, Opal's letter pressed against her chest, neck stiff from the angle, but mind clearer than it had been in months. Willa was already awake, sitting at the walnut kitchen table with a bowl of the canned peaches she'd discovered yesterday, reading one of Opal's survey maps with the concentration of a scholar examining primary sources. She'd organized the maps chronologically, Clara noticed, earliest dates on the left, most recent on the right, creating a visual timeline of the property's documentation that stretched across the table's considerable surface. "Mom, look at this." Willa pointed to a map dated 1893, the earliest in the collection. "The property lines are different from this one." She slid a more recent map, dated 1987, beside it. "See, our land used to be bigger. A lot bigger." Clara looked where her daughter was pointing. The 1893 map showed the Dawson homestead as 412 acres, nearly double the current deed. The boundary lines extended significantly further north and east, encompassing territory that Clara knew was now part of Whitfield Timber Holdings. The reduction had happened gradually, according to the map sequence Willa had arranged, shrinking by 20 or 30 acres every few decades through what the annotations described as boundary corrections and survey adjustments. "Someone kept making our land smaller." Willa's voice carried the particular outrage of a child who recognized unfairness even when she didn't fully understand its mechanisms. Clara touched her daughter's hair. "I think that's exactly what happened." Jonah appeared in the kitchen doorway, dressed in jeans and a flannel shirt he'd found in Opal's closet that fit him surprisingly well. He'd been outside already, Clara could tell, red clay on his boots and the flush of cold air on his cheeks. "I found the post. The northwest corner. It's about a quarter-mile from here, through those pines on the ridge." Clara looked at him. "How did you know which one?" Jonah pulled Opal's letter from his back pocket. "I read it last night. You fell asleep, and it was on the floor." He met her eyes with an expression that mixed apology with determination. "I'm 12, Mom. I can handle the truth about fence posts." Clara wanted to be angry about the invasion of privacy, but exhaustion and pragmatism overrode the impulse. What she saw in Jonah's face wasn't curiosity but conviction, the look of someone who'd found a problem worth solving and intended to solve it with the thoroughness he applied to geometry. "We go together." Clara's voice carried the authority of a mother who knew she couldn't stop her children from being involved, but could at least control the conditions. "All three of us, after breakfast. And we don't tell anyone what we find until we understand what it means." Willa bounced slightly in her chair. "We're treasure hunting. We're investigating," Clara corrected, though the distinction felt academic when your 8-year-old was vibrating with excitement. The walk to the northwest corner took 20 minutes through terrain that was equal parts beautiful and hostile. Pine needles carpeted paths that might have been deer trails or might have been routes Opal walked so often they'd become permanent features of the landscape. Blackberry brambles grabbed at clothing with thorns that drew blood and didn't apologize. The creek appeared and disappeared through the trees, its water running clear over stones that had been smoothed by centuries of patience. Jonah led, navigation assisted by a compass he'd found in Opal's desk and a printout of the 1893 survey map that showed the corner marker's precise location relative to natural landmarks. He moved through the woods with growing confidence, checking bearings, adjusting course, finding in the physical act of navigation a purpose that school had never provided. Willa cataloged everything they passed. Wildflowers she couldn't name but sketched in a notebook she'd brought. Bird calls she tried to imitate. Rocks with interesting shapes that she placed in her pockets until the weight made walking difficult, and Clara gently suggested she choose her 3 favorites and leave the rest for next time. The northwest corner marker announced itself through sheer presence. It was taller than the line posts by nearly 2 feet, standing over 6 feet above ground, its diameter suggesting the original cedar log had been substantial. The notches Opal had described were deep, cut into all 4 faces of the post at intervals that seemed deliberate rather than decorative. Time had darkened the wood to nearly black, but the grain remained visible, and when Clara placed her palm against the surface, the cedar felt warm despite the morning chill, as though it had been absorbing sunlight for a century and storing it for this moment. Around the post's base, the ground showed subtle disturbance. Not recent digging, but an area where the earth sat slightly higher than the surrounding terrain, a mound that might have been natural settling or might have been intentional placement of displaced soil smoothed over by decades of leaf fall and weather. Clara had brought a shovel from the shed behind the house. It was old, wooden handle worn smooth by Opal's hands, blade showing the particular curve that came from years of sharpening. She positioned it beside the post and looked at her children. "We dig carefully. If there's something down there, we don't want to damage it." Jonah knelt with a smaller trowel. Willa appointed herself lookout, climbing a nearby pine with the agility of someone who'd been waiting her whole life for permission to climb trees, settling into a fork of branches 12 feet up, where she could see the fence line in both directions. The first 6 inches were ordinary. Red Georgia clay mixed with decomposed organic matter, root fragments, the occasional stone. Clara worked methodically, creating a clean excavation rather than a hole, the way she'd seen archaeologists work in documentaries she watched during insomniac nights, when sleep felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. At 8 inches, the texture changed. The clay became denser, more uniform, suggesting it had been packed rather than naturally settled. Jonah noticed it too, his trowel scraping against resistance that organic soil didn't usually provide. "Someone compressed this." His voice carried the analytical precision that made him formidable at math and infuriating during arguments. "This isn't natural compaction. It's deliberate." At 14 inches, Jonah's trowel struck something that wasn't clay. The sound was metallic, muffled by earth, but unmistakable. He stopped digging and looked at Clara with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Something between fear and revelation. The face of a child who understood that what they were uncovering might change everything. Clara's hands joined his in the dirt, both of them scraping carefully around the object, fingers working with the delicacy of people who understood that some discoveries were fragile enough to be destroyed by impatience. The shape emerged gradually, rectangular, approximately the size of a shoebox, wrapped in oilcloth that had been treated with something that preserved it against moisture. The wrapping held firm despite its age, maintaining a seal that spoke of careful preparation by someone who expected their burial to last generations. "Mom." Willa's voice came from above, sharp with warning. "Someone's coming." A truck on the logging road. Clara and Jonah looked at each other. The logging road ran along the northern edge of the property, Whitfield territory, but close enough that anyone on it could see activity at the corner marker if they were looking. "How far?" Clara called up. "Maybe half a mile. Coming slow. Like they're watching." Clara made a decision that felt instinctive rather than calculated. She lifted the oilcloth package from the excavation, placed it in her backpack, and began refilling the hole with rapid efficiency. Jonah helped without being asked, both of them scooping clay back into the excavation and tamping it down with their boots. "We need to cover this. Make it look undisturbed." Jonah scattered pine needles and leaf litter over the freshly turned earth, while Clara smoothed the mound to match the surrounding terrain. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to fool a casual observer, maybe even a careful one if they weren't specifically looking for signs of digging. Willa descended from her tree with speed that suggested she'd been practicing descents in her mind since she climbed up. The truck stopped. I can see it through the trees. White, with a logo on the door. Whitfield Timber. Clara shouldered her backpack, feeling the weight of the oilcloth package against her spine, and took her children's hands. We walked back casually. If anyone asks, we were exploring the property, learning our way around. They moved through the pines with deliberate normalcy, Clara narrating the landscape for Willis. "Him. How did you know which one?" Jonah pulled Opal's letter from his back pocket. "I read it last night. You fell asleep, and it was on the floor." He met her eyes with an expression that mixed apology with determination. "I'm 12, Mom. I can handle the truth about fence posts." Clara wanted to be angry about the invasion of privacy, but exhaustion and pragmatism overrode the impulse. What she saw in Jonah's face wasn't curiosity but conviction, the look of someone who'd found a problem worth solving and intended to solve it with the thoroughness he applied to geometry. "We go together." Clara's voice carried the authority of a mother who knew she couldn't stop her children from being involved, but could at least control the conditions. "All three of us, after breakfast. And we don't tell anyone what we find until we understand what it means." Willa bounced slightly in her chair. "We're treasure hunting. We're investigating." Clara corrected, though the distinction felt academic when your 8-year-old was vibrating with excitement. The walk to the northwest corner took 20 minutes through terrain that was equal parts beautiful and hostile. Pine needles carpeted paths that might have been deer trails or might have been routes Opal walked so often they'd become permanent features of the landscape. Blackberry brambles grabbed at clothing with thorns that drew blood and didn't apologize. The creek appeared and disappeared through the trees, its water running clear over stones that had been smoothed by centuries of patience. Jonah led, navigation assisted by a compass he'd found in Opal's desk and a printout of the 1893 survey map that showed the corner marker's precise location relative to natural landmarks. He moved through the woods with growing confidence, checking bearings, adjusting course, finding in the physical act of navigation a purpose that school had never provided. Willa cataloged everything they passed. Wildflowers she couldn't name, but sketched in a notebook she'd brought. Bird calls she tried to imitate. Rocks with interesting shapes that she placed in her pockets until the weight made walking difficult, and Clara gently suggested she choose her 3 favorites and leave the rest for next time. The northwest corner marker announced itself through sheer presence. It was taller than the line posts by nearly 2 feet, standing over 6 feet above ground, its diameter suggesting the original cedar log had been substantial. The notches Opal had described were deep, cut into all 4 faces of the post at intervals that seemed deliberate rather than decorative. Time had darkened the wood to nearly black, but the grain remained visible, and when Clara placed her palm against the surface, the cedar felt warm despite the morning chill, as though it had been absorbing sunlight for a century and storing it for this moment. Around the post's base, the ground showed subtle disturbance. Not recent digging, but an area where the earth sat slightly higher than the surrounding terrain, a mound that might have been natural settling or might have been intentional placement of displaced soil smoothed over by decades of leaf fall and weather. Clara had brought a shovel from the shed behind the house. It was old, wooden handle worn smooth by Opal's hands, blade showing the particular curve that came from years of sharpening. She positioned it beside the post and looked at her children. "We dig carefully. If there's something down there, We don't want to damage it. Jonah knelt with a smaller trowel. Willa appointed herself lookout, climbing a nearby pine with the agility of someone who'd been waiting her whole life for permission to climb trees, settling into a fork of branches 12 feet up, where she could see the fence line in both directions. The first 6 inches were ordinary. Red Georgia clay mixed with decomposed organic matter, root fragments, the occasional stone. Clara worked methodically, creating a clean excavation rather than a hole, the way she'd seen archaeologists work in documentaries she watched during insomniac nights, when sleep felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. At 8 inches, the texture changed. The clay became denser, more uniform, suggesting it had been packed rather than naturally settled. Jonah noticed it too, his trowel scraping against resistance that organic soil didn't usually provide. Someone compressed this. His voice carried the analytical precision that made him formidable at math and infuriating during arguments. This isn't natural compaction. It's deliberate. At 14 inches, Jonah's trowel struck something that wasn't clay. The sound was metallic, muffled by earth, but unmistakable. He stopped digging and looked at Clara with an expression she would remember for the rest of her life. Something between fear and revelation. The face of a child who understood that what they were uncovering might change everything. Clara's hands joined his in the dirt, both of them scraping carefully around the object, fingers working with the delicacy of people who understood that some discoveries were fragile enough to be destroyed by impatience. The shape emerged gradually, rectangular, approximately the size of a shoebox, wrapped in oilcloth that had been treated with something that preserved it against moisture. The wrapping held firm despite its age, maintaining a seal that spoke of careful preparation by someone who expected their burial to last generations. "Mom." Willa's voice came from above, sharp with warning. "Someone's coming." A truck, on the logging road. Clara and Jonah looked at each other. The logging road ran along the northern edge of the property, Whitfield territory, but close enough that anyone on it could see activity at the corner marker if they were looking. "How far?" Clara called up. "Maybe half a mile. Coming slow. Like they're watching." Clara made a decision that felt instinctive rather than calculated. She lifted the oilcloth package from the excavation, placed it in her backpack, and began refilling the hole with rapid efficiency. Jonah helped without being asked, both of them scooping clay back into the excavation and tamping it down with their boots. "We need to cover this. Make it look undisturbed." Jonah scattered pine needles and leaf litter over the freshly turned earth, while Clara smoothed the mound to match the surrounding terrain. It wasn't perfect, but it was good enough to fool a casual observer, maybe even a careful one if they weren't specifically looking for signs of digging. Willa descended from her tree with speed that suggested she'd been practicing descents in her mind since she climbed up. The truck stopped. I can see it through the trees. White, with a logo on the door. Whitfield Timber. Clara shouldered her backpack, feeling the weight of the oilcloth package against her spine, and took her children's hands. We walked back casually. If anyone asks, we were exploring the property, learning our way around. They moved through the pines with deliberate normalcy, Clara narrating the landscape for Willis. The Dawson property. She'd excavated 1. 10 remained. But it wasn't just the corner markers on her land that mattered. If Ezekiel had buried evidence at every corner post he'd placed during the original 1893 survey, there could be dozens more across the 17,000 acres, most of them now on Whitfield property, inaccessible without permission that would never be granted once the Whitfields understood what was being unearthed. The mathematics of the situation arranged themselves in Clara's mind with the cold precision that poverty had taught her. She had documents proving fraud. She had no money for lawyers. She had 2 children who needed stability. She had neighbors who stood to lose a fortune if the truth surfaced. And she had 10 more corner markers that might contain additional evidence, but excavating them would require time, secrecy, and a plan that accounted for the white truck she'd seen on the logging road, watching. By dawn, she had the beginnings of a strategy. Not elegant, not comprehensive, but functional in the way that survival plans always were, built from available materials rather than ideal ones. The second corner marker stood at the northeast boundary, a 40-minute walk through terrain that climbed steadily toward a ridge overlooking the creek. Clara took the children at first light, before the logging crews would begin their shifts on Whitfield land. moving through the pines with a silence that had less to do with stealth and more to do with the particular hush that rural mornings imposed on anyone willing to listen. Jonah carried the shovel. Willa carried a backpack containing water bottles, granola bars, and a notebook in which she'd begun sketching each corner marker with the detailed attention of someone who understood that documentation was its own form of protection. If someone destroyed the posts, her drawings would preserve their locations, dimensions, and the notch patterns that Ezekiel had carved to encode information she hadn't yet deciphered. The northeast marker was shorter than the northwest post but wider, its base surrounded by stones that might have been decorative or might have been structural, holding the post steady against a century of freeze-thaw cycles and Georgia storms. Clara dug with greater confidence this time, knowing the approximate depth and the feel of intentionally compacted clay versus natural soil. At 16 inches, Jonah's trowel found the second box. Same construction, same oilcloth wrapping, same wax seal. But the contents were different. Instead of survey documents, this box held a leather journal, its pages filled with Ezekiel's handwriting, dense and small and precise. A personal account of the fraud as it unfolded, dated entries spanning 1899 to 1903, documenting conversations overheard, meetings witnessed, threats received, and ultimately the systematic destruction of his professional reputation by people who couldn't allow a surveyor with a conscience to remain credible. December 14, 1899, Clara read aloud, her voice barely above the sound of wind through pine needles. Judge Whitfield summoned me to his office today, informed me that my original survey contained errors and that revised plats would be filed replacing my work. When I protested that my measurements were accurate to within 6 inches across 17,000 acres, he suggested that surveying was imprecise science and that my career would benefit from accepting the corrections gracefully. He did not say what would happen if I refused, but his meaning was understood by both of us. March 3, 1900. The Henderson family received notice that their homestead claim had been reduced from 480 acres to 290 acres due to survey adjustment. Mr. Henderson came to me in great distress. I showed him my original plat, but he has no recourse because the county records now show the revised boundaries and my professional standing has been publicly questioned. Judge Whitfield purchased the surplus 190 acres through his holding company at auction for $11. Willa stopped sketching. $11 for 190 acres? That's how theft works when you control the system. Clara's voice carried a hardness she usually kept hidden from her children. You make it legal on paper even when it's criminal in practice. The journal continued through 4 years of entries, each one documenting another family cheated, another parcel seized, another piece of evidence that Ezekiel couldn't use because the systems designed to hear complaints had been purchased by the man he was complaining about. The final entry, dated September 1903, carried the weight of a man who'd exhausted every legitimate avenue and was preparing for a fight that would outlast his lifetime. I have buried the truth at every corner I marked. If they destroy me, if they burn the courthouse again, if they silence every voice that speaks against them, the posts will remain. Cedar endures. The earth remembers. Someday someone will dig and find what I've preserved and understand that justice does not expire simply because the men who owed it are dead. Clara closed the journal carefully, rewrapped it in oilcloth, and placed it in her backpack. She refilled the hole, scattered debris, and began the walk home with her children in silence, each of them processing the weight of what they'd read. A man they'd never met, dead for over a century, speaking across time with the desperate eloquence of someone who knew he would not be believed in his own era, but refused to let that stop him from documenting what he'd witnessed. The third corner marker yielded a box containing title abstracts, original homestead filing receipts, and signed statements from 3 of the 31 families confirming their original acreage allocations, notarized by a justice of the peace in the neighboring county where Judge Whitfield's influence didn't reach. The fourth contained a hand-drawn map of the entire 17,000 acres with each homestead parcel numbered and labeled, cross-referenced with a list of the 31 families and their assigned acreage. Ezekiel had drawn it with the precision of someone who understood that maps were arguments made in ink, and this particular argument was devastating. The fifth marker, at the southeast corner nearest the county road, produced the most emotionally significant find. Photographs. Tintype images of the 31 homestead families, posed formally beside their claim markers, holding documents that prove their right to land they would soon lose. Faces frozen in silver and time, men and women and children who'd traveled to northwest Georgia with the promise of property and the faith that the government's word meant something. Willa cried when she saw them. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet intensity of a child who understood that the people in the photographs had been real and had suffered and had never received justice. She held each image carefully, studying faces that had been waiting underground for someone to look at them with something other than indifference. They had names, Mom. She pointed to the careful script on the back of each photograph. The Hendersons, the Washingtons, the Clementes, the Nguyen's. They were families. Like us. Clara knelt beside her daughter. Yes, exactly like us. And they deserved better than what they got. Over the following 2 weeks, Clara excavated all 11 corner markers on Dawson property. Each contained evidence that expanded and reinforced what they'd already found. Legal documents, personal testimonies, financial records, correspondence between Judge Whitfield and his co-conspirators, and Ezekiel's relentless journal entries that transformed scattered evidence into a coherent narrative of systematic theft. She worked in the early mornings and late evenings, timing her excavations to avoid the Whitfield logging crews whose schedules she'd mapped by watching the road from Willa's favorite climbing tree. Jonah maintained a spreadsheet on a borrowed laptop, cataloging each discovery with the methodical precision that made him exceptional at mathematics and increasingly essential to their investigation. Willa continued her sketches, documenting not just the posts but the surrounding landscape, creating visual records that placed each piece of evidence in its physical context. The collection, when assembled on the walnut table, covered every surface and spilled onto the floor. Over 130 years of preserved evidence, enough to reconstruct the entire fraud with documentary proof that no court could dismiss as hearsay or speculation. Clara photographed everything with her phone, the only piece of technology she owned that was worth more than its weight in frustration. She uploaded the images to a cloud account she created specifically for this purpose, using the library's Wi-Fi in town because the Dawson property had no internet service. Backup copies went on to a USB drive she kept in her bra, which was uncomfortable but seemed the safest location she could think of given that her house had no locks worth mentioning and the Whitfields had demonstrated interest in her activities. The confrontation Clara had been expecting came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after they'd arrived. Gerald Whitfield returned, this time without Travis, but with a woman whose tailored suit and leather briefcase announced her profession before she opened her mouth. Clara, this is Margaret Shun, our family attorney. Gerald's voice carried a friendliness that felt increasingly transparent. We wanted to discuss the property situation more formally. Margaret Shun had the posture of someone accustomed to intimidating people in conference rooms that cost more per square foot than Clara's entire house. She produced documents from her briefcase with the practiced efficiency of a weapon being drawn. Mrs. Dawson, we've reviewed the property records, and there are some concerns about boundary compliance. Several of your fence structures extend beyond the current deed boundaries as recorded with the county. We're prepared to overlook these encroachments if you're willing to discuss a sale, but if not, we'll need to address the matter through proper channels. Clara studied the documents Margaret placed on the porch railing. Survey maps showing Dawson fence posts crossing onto Whitfield property, highlighted in yellow like evidence of crime. Which, Clara now understood, they were, just not in the direction Margaret was suggesting. Those posts were placed in 1893 by a licensed state surveyor. Clara kept her voice level. Your boundary records were filed after the county clerk altered the original plats at Judge Harlan Whitfield's instruction. The silence that followed was nuclear. Gerald's face underwent a transformation that Clara watched with the detached fascination of someone witnessing a controlled demolition. Friendliness collapsed, neighborly warmth imploded, and what remained was the raw architecture of a man whose family fortune rested on a foundation he'd always known was hollow. I don't know what you think you've found. His voice dropped the warmth like a coat he no longer needed. But old stories from an unstable woman don't constitute legal evidence. Clara felt Opal's letter in her pocket, felt the weight of Ezekiel's journal in the backpack hanging just inside the front door, felt the presence of over 130 years of preserved documentation waiting in her kitchen cabinets behind canned peaches. My grandmother wasn't unstable. She was patient. There's a difference. Margaret Chin's professional composure showed its first fracture, a slight tightening around the eyes that suggested she'd been briefed on the possibility of this conversation, but hadn't expected it to arrive so directly. Mrs. Dawson, whatever historical documents you may have discovered, the current property records reflect legal boundaries that have been in place for over a century. Challenging those boundaries would require extensive litigation that, frankly, you're not in a position to pursue. The assessment was accurate and cruel in the way that accurate assessments of poverty often were. Clara had $17 and evidence worth potentially millions. The gap between having proof and having the resources to use it felt as wide as the gap between the original survey and the fraudulent one that replaced it. Gerald leaned forward, and his voice took on the particular softness that men with power used when they wanted to appear reasonable while making threats. Clara, let's be practical. You're a single mother with 2 children living in a house that needs $40,000 in repairs, on land that generates no income, with no visible means of supporting yourselves beyond the short term. We're offering $12,000 and a clean exit. Take it, start fresh somewhere appropriate, and let everyone move on. Somewhere appropriate. The phrase landed with the same weight it had carried during his first visit. Clara Dawson and her fence posts and her children and her dead grandmother's obsessive documentation did not belong here. They belonged somewhere small and contained and forgettable, where their poverty couldn't inconvenience anyone with real money. Jonah appeared in the doorway. He'd been listening, and his face carried an expression Clara recognized from the moment he'd calculated the per-acre value of Gerald's offer. An expression that said the math was clear and the math was damning and the math didn't care about power dynamics or expensive attorneys. You should leave now. Jonah's voice held none of the deference that adults expected from children addressing their betters. Before I start recording this conversation on my phone and uploading it to every social media platform I can access from the library. Gerald's face flushed with the particular shade of red that comes from being challenged by someone who shouldn't have the standing to challenge you. Margaret Chin placed a hand on his arm, professional judgment overriding personal offense. We'll be in touch through proper channels. Margaret gathered her documents with the controlled movements of someone making a tactical withdrawal. I'd recommend you consult an attorney, Mrs. Dawson. The boundary issues will need to be resolved one way or another. They left in Gerald's truck, tires throwing gravel in a way that felt more aggressive than the terrain required. Clara watched them go, then turned to Jonah, who was trembling slightly despite his composed delivery. That was brave. That was necessary. He looked at her with eyes that carried weight no 12-year-old should bear. They're going to come back with something worse, aren't they? Yes. Clara put her arm around her son's shoulders, feeling the tension in his frame, the coiled readiness of someone who'd learned that standing up had consequences. But we're going to be ready. Being ready required help that Clara couldn't afford and didn't know how to find. She spent the next 3 days at the Dalton Public Library, using their computers and Wi-Fi to research property law, adverse possession, historical land fraud, and the legal mechanisms for challenging century-old boundary records. What she found was simultaneously encouraging and terrifying. The law was clear that fraud had no statute of limitations when it involved property obtained through forged documents. But pursuing claims required attorneys, filing fees, expert witnesses, and the kind of institutional support that rural single mothers with $17 did not typically command. Willa saved them. Or rather, Willa's instinct for finding things saved them, the same instinct that had led her to organize Opal's maps chronologically and discover the boundary discrepancies on their first day. She was in the library's children's section, reading while Clara researched, when she wandered into the adjacent community bulletin board area and found a flyer pinned between a lost cat notice and an advertisement for a church rummage sale. Free legal clinic, Appalachian Justice Project. Property disputes, tenant rights, land fraud, environmental cases. Pro bono representation for qualifying families. Next clinic, Saturday, 10 a.m., Dalton Community Center. Mom. Willa appeared at Clara's elbow holding the flyer like it was a treasure map. Which, in a sense, it was. I found lawyers. The Appalachian Justice Project operated from a converted warehouse in downtown Dalton, staffed by attorneys who'd chosen purpose over profit and legal assistants who worked for wages that suggested they shared that priority. The Saturday clinic was crowded with people whose problems ranged from eviction disputes to workplace injuries to the particular legal tangles that poverty created when it intersected with systems designed by and for people with money. Clara waited 2 hours, Willa reading on the floor beside her, Jonah doing homework in a plastic chair that creaked ominously every time he shifted position. When her number was called, she followed a young woman with tired eyes and a warm handshake into a small office that smelled like coffee and copy paper. "I'm Ruth Hadley. Tell me your situation." Clara started at the beginning. The inheritance, the property, the fence posts, the Whitfield offer, Opal's letter. Ruth listened with the particular intensity of someone trained to hear legal implications in personal narratives, occasionally making notes on a yellow pad, but mostly watching Clara's face as though the story's credibility could be measured in the storyteller's expression. When Clara reached the corner markers and the buried evidence, Ruth's pen stopped moving. She leaned forward, professional composure giving way to something more personal. "You're telling me you have original survey documents from 1893, a written confession from the county clerk who altered the records, a personal journal documenting the fraud over 4 years, and physical evidence buried at 11 locations on your property." Clara opened her backpack and placed photographs on the desk. Images of every document, every journal page, every photograph of the 31 families. She'd organized them chronologically, the way Willa had taught her, creating a visual narrative that moved from the original survey through the fraud to the cover-up and beyond. Ruth studied the photographs for 15 minutes, flipping through them with increasing speed as the implications accumulated. When she looked up, her expression had changed from professional interest to something Clara could only describe as controlled excitement. "This is extraordinary. If these documents are authentic, and they certainly appear to be, you have evidence of one of the most significant land fraud cases in Georgia history." She paused, calculating. How many families were affected? 31. Clara heard the number differently now than she had when she'd first read it. Not an abstraction, but a population, lives disrupted, futures diminished, descendants still living with the consequences of theft their great-grandparents suffered. 14,000 acres total, taken through forged surveys and a corrupt judge. The land is now worth. She hesitated, unsure of the precision her estimates deserved. Ruth didn't hesitate. Whitfield Timber's holdings are valued at approximately $68 million based on their most recent property tax filings. If 14,000 of their 37,000 acres were obtained through fraud, that's roughly $25 million in stolen property at current assessment. But timber rights, mineral rights, and development potential push the real value significantly higher. We could be looking at $40 to $60 million in claims. The number hung in the small office like smoke, too large to breathe normally around. Clara felt the room tilt slightly, the way it did when exhaustion and revelation combined to make reality feel like something she was watching rather than experiencing. Ruth was already reaching for her phone. "I need to bring in our senior attorney. This is way beyond a Saturday clinic case." She stopped, looking at Clara with an expression that mixed professional assessment with genuine human concern. "Are you okay?" Clara thought about Opal walking her fence line for 63 years. About Ezekiel driving posts into Georgia clay with the precision of a man building a case the courts of his era wouldn't hear. About 31 families whose photographs she'd held in her hands, faces staring up from tintype images with the patient expectation of people who believed promises eventually got kept. "I'm fine." She straightened in her chair. "I've been worse." Ruth smiled with the particular warmth of someone who recognized resilience, because she'd seen enough of its absence to appreciate its presence. "I believe you have." The senior attorney was James Okonkwo, a man whose physical presence filled rooms the way his voice filled courtrooms, both completely and without apology. He was 53, built like someone who'd played football in college and maintained the discipline without the competition, with eyes that assessed everything and revealed nothing until he'd decided what he thought. He drove from Atlanta the following Tuesday, arriving at the Dawson property in a car that was newer than Clara's, but not by enough to suggest vanity. He brought Ruth, a paralegal named David who carried equipment for scanning documents, and a quiet intensity that suggested he'd already reviewed the photographs Clara had provided and found them compelling enough to make a 4-hour drive. "Show me everything." James stood at the walnut table, sleeves rolled to his elbows, hands flat on the surface as though grounding himself against the weight of what he was about to absorb. Clara laid out the documents in the order she'd excavated them. The original survey plat, the county clerk's confession, Ezekiel's journal, the title abstracts and filing receipts, the family photographs, the maps showing original boundaries versus current recorded ones, the discrepancies that Opal had annotated in red ink over decades of careful comparison. James read for 2 hours. David scanned each document with professional equipment, creating digital copies that would survive even if the originals were destroyed. Ruth cross-referenced Ezekiel's entries with public records she'd pulled from county archives, confirming dates, names, and property transactions that corroborated the journal's narrative. When James finally looked up, his expression carried the controlled satisfaction of someone who'd just found a case worth fighting. "The evidence is overwhelming. Authentication will be necessary, document analysis, dating verification, handwriting confirmation, but the internal consistency alone makes fabrication virtually impossible. No one creates a fraud this detailed across this many documents with this level of corroborating detail." He turned to Clara. "I want to take this case pro bono, with the understanding that if we recover damages, the Appalachian Justice Project takes 15% to fund future cases. The rest goes to you and the descendant families." Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. The gap between having evidence and having the resources to use it had just closed, and the sensation was so unfamiliar it took her a moment to identify it. Relief. Not the temporary kind that came from making rent or finding a $20 bill in an old coat, but the structural kind that came from knowing that competent people were going to help you carry weight you'd been bearing alone. But first, James continued, we need to find the 31 families. Or rather, their descendants. If we're going to file claims for property restitution, we need the rightful heirs to be part of the action. This isn't just your case, Clara. It belongs to everyone who was cheated. Finding the descendants became Willa's project. Not because Clara assigned it to her, but because Willa's systematic mind and natural research instincts made her the ideal person for the task, and because giving her a role that mattered transformed her from a child along for the ride into a contributing member of something larger than herself. She started with the 31 names from Ezekiel's family register, cross-referencing them with census records available through the library's genealogy database. The work was slow, painstaking, and occasionally heartbreaking. Families that had stayed in the county, living in diminished circumstances on reduced homesteads while watching Whitfields prosper. Families that had left, migrating to cities in search of opportunities that should have existed on the land they'd been promised. Families that had simply disappeared from records, their stories ending in gaps that might have meant death or displacement or the particular invisibility that comes from being poor in a country that measures worth in acres. Jonah helped with the mathematics, calculating how much each family's stolen acreage was worth at current values, adjusting for timber revenue the Whitfields had generated from that specific land over the decades. The numbers were staggering. Individual family claims ranged from $400,000 to over $3 million, depending on the size of the original homestead and the current use of the stolen acreage. Within a month, they'd located descendants of 24 of the 31 families. Some lived within 50 miles of the original homesteads, working jobs that paid just enough to make desperation manageable, but never quite comfortable. Others had scattered across the southeast, carrying family stories about land lost to bad luck or poor judgment, never knowing that their ancestors had been deliberately cheated by a system designed to look legitimate. Ruth and David made the calls, professional voices delivering news that sounded too extraordinary to be credible. Your family was defrauded in 1899. We have evidence. We want to file claims on your behalf. The reactions ranged from disbelief to tears to the particular silence that comes from processing information that rewrites everything you thought you knew about your family's history. Thomas Henderson was the first descendant to visit the Dawson property. 67 years old, retired mail carrier from Chatsworth, grandson of the James Henderson whose homestead had been reduced by 190 acres for $11. He drove up in a pickup truck that was older than Clara's sedan and in better condition, stepped out with the careful movements of a man whose knees had filed complaints his pride refused to acknowledge, and stood in Clara's kitchen looking at the documents that proved his grandfather had been robbed. My daddy always said we came from nothing. Thomas's voice was thick with emotion that decades of stoicism couldn't quite contain. Said his father lost everything because he wasn't smart enough to hold on to it. That's the story I grew up with. That's the story I told my children. That we came from people who couldn't make it work. He picked up the photograph of his grandfather, a young man in overalls standing beside a homestead marker with his wife and 3 children, holding the filing receipt that proved his claim to 480 acres of Georgia land. He wasn't a failure. Thomas's tears fell onto the walnut table, darkening the wood in small circles. He was stolen from, by people who had the law in their pocket and the power to rewrite what happened. Clara watched 23 more families arrive over the following weeks, each carrying versions of the same story. Ancestors who'd failed, inherited shame that shaped how they saw themselves and what they believed they deserved. Generational poverty that now had an explanation beyond personal inadequacy. Delia Washington, 44, whose great-grandmother had lost 320 acres that were now the site of Whitfield's main processing facility. Marco Clementi, 38, whose family had immigrated from Italy specifically to claim homestead land and had their claim reduced by 60% within 6 years of arrival. Anna Nguyen, 51, whose Vietnamese grandparents had been among the few Asian families to receive homestead grants in the 1890s, only to have half their property seized through the same mechanism that victimized every other family on Ezekiel's list. Each visit added emotional weight to the legal case that James was assembling with methodical precision. He filed preservation orders to protect the physical evidence. He engaged a document authentication expert from Emory University who confirmed that the paper, ink, and handwriting in Ezekiel's documents were consistent with late 19th century origins. He retained a forensic surveyor who walked the Dawson property with GPS equipment and confirmed that Ezekiel's original corner markers were accurate to within 4 inches across the entire grid, a level of precision that validated his professional competence beyond any reasonable challenge. The Whitfields responded to the preservation orders with the particular fury of people who understood that their foundation was being excavated with the same methodical precision they'd used to build on it. Margaret Chin filed motions to dismiss, claiming that the documents were forgeries, that Clara had fabricated evidence to support a baseless claim, that Opal Dawson's well-documented eccentricity undermined any testimony she might have provided. James demolished each argument with the patience of someone who'd been preparing for this kind of fight his entire career. Forged documents don't survive carbon dating. Fabricated evidence doesn't match public records across 4 counties. And Opal Dawson's eccentricity was the direct result of spending 63 years protecting evidence that the Whitfield family would have destroyed if they'd known it existed. The break-in happened on a night when Clara should have expected it, but somehow didn't. She'd grown accustomed to the isolation of the property, to the darkness that rural Georgia wrapped around itself like a blanket, to the sounds of the house settling and the woods shifting and the creek running its perpetual course over stones that didn't care about human conflicts. Willow woke her at 2 in the morning. "Mom, there's someone outside." Clara moved to the window, pulse hammering, and saw flashlight beams moving along the fence line. 2 figures, maybe 3, working their way from post to post with the systematic progression of people following a map. They carried tools, shovels, and pry bars visible in the sweeping light, and they were heading toward the corner markers. "Call 911. Clara's voice was calm in the way that crisis sometimes produced, adrenaline converting fear into focus. "Tell them someone is trespassing on our property with tools. Then wake your brother." She grabbed the shotgun Opal had kept beside the back door, a 12-gauge that Clara had learned to shoot during childhood visits, when Opal had insisted that every Dawson should know how to protect what was theirs. She hadn't fired it in over 20 years, but the weight felt familiar, the way certain forms of readiness embedded themselves in muscle memory and waited for the moment they'd be needed. Clara stepped onto the back porch and racked the shotgun with a sound that carried through the night air like a declaration. The flashlight beam stopped. "You're on private property." Her voice didn't shake, which surprised her. "I've called the sheriff's department. You have about 8 minutes to leave before they arrive, and I'm a Dawson, which means I know how to use what I'm holding." The beams moved rapidly, retreating toward the logging road where Clara could hear a vehicle idling. Doors slammed, tires spun on gravel, and the darkness swallowed them with the efficiency of something that had been hiding intruders for longer than tonight. Sheriff's deputies arrived in 12 minutes, which was faster than Clara had expected for a rural property call. Deputy Maria Esperanza took the report with the particular thoroughness of someone who'd been briefed on the Dawson situation by channels Clara didn't know existed. Any idea who they were? Clara looked at the fence line where boot prints would be visible in the morning. I know who sent them. Deputy Esperanza followed her gaze toward the Whitfield property boundary, visible only as an absence of trees where managed forest ended and wild growth began. I'll need you to say that officially if you want to file a complaint. Gerald Whitfield hired people to dig up evidence from my corner markers because he knows what's buried there, and he knows it proves his family stole 14,000 acres from 31 homestead families. The deputy wrote, without commentary, professional detachment, hiding whatever personal reaction the statement produced. Any evidence to support that specific accusation? They were digging at the corner markers. Not randomly. They followed the fence line directly to the survey points. The only people who know what's at those locations are my family, my attorneys, and the Whitfield family. Deputy Esperanza closed her notebook. I'll file the report and follow up. In the meantime, I'd recommend securing the property. Motion-activated lights, cameras if you can afford them. Clara couldn't afford cameras. She could barely afford the electricity to power motion-activated lights. But she nodded, because admitting the full extent of her vulnerability felt like handing ammunition to people who already had arsenals. James Okonkwo arrived the next morning, having driven through the night after Clara's call. He walked the fence line with her, documenting the boot prints, the disturbed soil near two corner markers where digging had begun before Clara's intervention, the tire tracks on the logging road that matched the tread pattern of vehicles commonly used by Whitfield timber operations. This changes the legal calculus. James photographed everything with methodical precision. Attempted destruction of evidence. Trespassing with intent. If we can connect this to the Whitfields, it demonstrates consciousness of guilt that strengthens every claim we're filing. Can we connect it? James looked at her. They sent people to dig up specific locations that only someone with knowledge of the original survey grid would target. That knowledge is limited to your family, our legal team, and the Whitfield family who've been trying to suppress this information for 4 generations. The circumstantial evidence is compelling. He made 3 phone calls from Clara's porch. The first to Ruth, authorizing immediate filing of the property restitution claims. The second to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, reporting attempted evidence tampering in an active legal matter. The third to a journalist named Sandra Kim at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, who covered rural property disputes and had been trying to write about Whitfield Timber's land acquisition practices for years, but had never found evidence strong enough to support publication. We're ready to go public. James looked at Clara with an expression that mixed professional determination with personal concern. Once this story breaks, everything changes. Media attention brings scrutiny, which protects you, but it also brings pressure that can be overwhelming. Are you prepared for that? Clara thought about the eviction notice in Tennessee. About 4 moves in 6 years. About $17 and canned peaches, and a grandmother who'd walked her fence line in every kind of weather for 63 years because she understood that some fights required more endurance than force. I've been living in my car. I've been feeding my kids from food banks. I've been told that I belong somewhere more suitable by a man whose fortune is built on theft. She met James's eyes. I'm prepared for whatever comes next because I've already survived what came before. James nodded with the quiet respect of someone recognizing strength he hadn't fully appreciated. Then we file tomorrow. All 24 claims simultaneously. And Sandra runs her story the same day. The legal filing landed like a controlled explosion. 24 simultaneous civil suits against Whitfield Timber Company, each representing a different descendant family, each supported by authenticated documents that had survived underground for over a century. The claims sought property restitution, compensatory damages for over 120 years of lost timber revenue, and punitive damages for the ongoing concealment of fraud. Sandra Kim's article appeared in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution the same morning, above the fold, with a headline that Clara would remember for the rest of her life. Buried Truth, how one family's fence posts exposed a century of land theft. The article was thorough, detailed, and devastating. It traced the fraud from Judge Whitfield's original scheme through 4 generations of concealment, documenting how the Whitfield family had systematically suppressed evidence, discredited witnesses, and maintained their empire on foundations that a surveyor's fence posts had been quietly disproving for over 130 years. The article included photographs of the descendant families, past and present. Ezekiel's tintype images beside modern portraits of their grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Thomas Henderson holding his grandfather's homestead receipt. Delia Washington standing on the ground where her great-grandmother's 320 acres had been absorbed into Whitfield's processing facility. Anna and Wynn's family gathered around a kitchen table, looking at documents that proved their American dream had been stolen before it could properly begin. The response was immediate and overwhelming. National media picked up the story within hours. Cable news ran segments with the fence posts as visual backdrop, reporters standing among the cedar markers while explaining how a single mother's inheritance had uncovered one of the largest land fraud cases in Georgia history. Social media amplified the narrative beyond what traditional media could contain. The combination of historical injustice, corporate greed, and a sympathetic protagonist creating the kind of story that algorithms were designed to promote. Gerald Whitfield issued a statement through Margaret Chun denying all allegations and calling the documents fabrications produced by a disturbed individual seeking to extort a legitimate business. The statement landed poorly against the authenticated evidence and the faces of 24 families whose stories of generational poverty now had an explanation that didn't blame their ancestors for being failures. Travis Whitfield made things worse by confronting a camera crew outside the Whitfield corporate office, his polo shirt privilege clashing with the aggression in his voice. "Those fence posts are on our property. That woman is trespassing and manufacturing evidence. We'll see her in court." The clip went viral, the image of a wealthy man in a branded polo shirt claiming ownership of property that authenticated documents proved had been stolen becoming a symbol of the disconnect between inherited privilege and earned credibility. Clara watched the coverage from her kitchen, surrounded by her children and the maps and the evidence that Ezekiel had preserved with the faith of a man who believed posterity would care even if his contemporaries didn't. Willa compiled media coverage in a scrapbook she'd started, cutting articles from newspapers the library donated after their display periods ended. Jonah tracked the legal developments on his spreadsheet, adding columns for media mentions, public statements, and the stock price of Whitfield timber, which had dropped 14% since the article published. Mrs. Carter would have loved this moment. The thought came unbidden, and Clara realized she was thinking of Opal, who'd spent 6 decades waiting for exactly this kind of reckoning and hadn't lived to see it arrive. But the reckoning was far from complete. Gerald Whitfield had resources that dwarfed the Appalachian Justice Project's budget. He hired 3 additional law firms, each specializing in different aspects of the defense: property law, media relations, and what James grimly described as reputation destruction. They filed counterclaims alleging defamation, tortious interference with business relationships, and the novel argument that century-old survey posts constituted encroachment on Whitfield property and should be removed. The motion to remove the fence posts arrived at Clara's house by courier on a Friday afternoon, which was when bad news was traditionally delivered because weekends provided buffer time for reactions to cool before business hours returned. The legal language was clinical, but the intent was clear. If they couldn't suppress the evidence, they would destroy it. Remove the posts, and the physical markers that anchored Ezekiel's survey to the landscape would be gone, leaving only documents that could be challenged in the abstract. James filed an emergency injunction within hours, arguing that the posts constituted irreplaceable historical evidence under active legal protection and that their removal would constitute spoliation of evidence warranting severe sanctions. The judge granted the injunction by Saturday morning, but the attempt revealed the Whitfield strategy with brutal clarity. They weren't fighting to win in court. They were fighting to ensure that if they lost, nothing would remain for anyone else to claim. The community response surprised Clara more than anything else. Neighbors she'd never met began appearing at the property, bringing food, offering labor, providing the kind of support that rural communities mobilized when they recognized injustice that could have happened to any of them. Frank Espinoza, who ran the hardware store in town, delivered motion-activated security lights and installed them himself, refusing payment with the gruff generosity of a man who expressed caring through competence. Martha Okafor, who taught history at the local high school, organized her students to research the 31 families using primary sources, turning the Dawson case into a living history project that generated additional documentation and public awareness. Pastor James Willis opened his church hall for community meetings where descendant families could connect with each other and with legal resources they'd never known existed. The momentum felt like something living, organic, and growing, fed by the particular energy that justice generates when it finally finds a channel after being damned for generations. Clara stood at the center of it not because she'd sought that position, but because inheritance had placed her there, and the stubborn Dawson genetics that Opal had cultivated through 63 years of fence-line walking refused to let her step aside. On a Tuesday evening in late April, 6 weeks after the story broke and the lawsuits were filed, Clara sat on the porch watching the fence posts catch the last light. Willow was inside organizing the descendant family profiles she'd compiled, 24 complete packages containing historical records, current contact information, and the emotional narratives that transformed legal claims into human stories. Jonah was reviewing James's latest filing strategy, his mathematical mind finding satisfaction in the logical architecture of legal arguments that used numbers the way he used them, as proof that couldn't be disputed by opinions. Clara's phone buzzed. James Okonkwo's name on the screen. We got the forensic survey results back. His voice carried the controlled excitement she'd learned to recognize as significant news delivered with professional restraint. The GPS analysis of Ezekiel's corner markers confirms his original survey to within 3.7 inches across the entire 17,000-acre grid. That's better accuracy than some modern surveys achieve with satellite assistance. Clara closed her eyes. A man with a compass and a chain and cedar posts he'd carved himself, measuring 17,000 acres of Georgia wilderness with precision that technology 130 years later could barely improve upon. But there's more. James paused, and Clara heard papers shuffling. The forensic team found something we didn't expect. The notch patterns on the corner markers aren't decorative. They're a code. Ezekiel developed a system for encoding survey data directly into the posts using a series of cuts at specific depths and intervals. Each notch pattern contains the original coordinates, bearing, and distance measurements for that marker's position. He carved the survey data into the posts themselves as a backup in case the buried documents were ever found and destroyed. The revelation settled into Clara's understanding like a key finding a lock that had been waiting for exactly its shape. Ezekiel hadn't just preserved evidence. He'd built a system so redundant, so deeply integrated into the physical landscape, that destroying it would require removing every post he'd ever placed across 17,000 acres. The fence posts weren't just markers or evidence containers. They were the survey itself, encoded in cedar and notches, and the stubborn faith of a man who understood that some truths needed to be written in materials that lasted longer than paper. They're the survey, Clara said quietly. The posts are the actual survey record, carved into wood that lasts centuries. James's voice softened. Your great-great-grandfather was a genius, Clara. He created a system that no one could alter without physically destroying every post. And your grandmother spent 63 years making sure no one did. Clara looked at the fence line, dark shapes against the darkening sky. Posts that everyone had dismissed as an old woman's obsession, standing in rows that encoded justice in a language no one had known how to read until now. She thought about Opal walking those lines in rain and heat and snow, touching each post, checking each notch, maintaining evidence that was simultaneously invisible and indestructible. A woman everyone called crazy because the truth she was protecting was too large to see from the ground, visible only from the elevation that time and patience provided. The posts remember what the papers forgot. Opal's annotation on her maps. Not poetry, Clara realized now. Literal truth. The posts remembered because Ezekiel had carved memory into their grain, and Opal had kept those memories alive through the simple, stubborn, dismissed act of walking her lines. Clara stood on the porch, phone still pressed to her ear, and spoke words she hadn't planned, but which arrived with the certainty of something that had been waiting to be said. We're going to win this, aren't we? James's response carried the weight of a man who'd spent his career fighting for people the system had failed. "We're going to try. And we have 130 years of evidence on our side. Plus fence posts that are smarter than anyone gave them credit for." Clara laughed, the sound surprising her with its genuineness, its freedom from the particular tension that had been her constant companion for so long she'd forgotten what its absence felt like. She looked at her children through the kitchen window, Willa surrounded by family profiles and Jonah buried in legal documents, both of them engaged in work that mattered in ways that survival work never had. They'd come here with $17 in garbage bags full of clothes and a grandmother's inheritance that everyone said was worthless. Old fence posts on overgrown land in rural Georgia, the kind of bequest that confirmed what people already believed about the Dawson family, that they came from nothing and would return to nothing, and everything in between was just filling time. But the posts had been waiting, patient as the cedar they were carved from, holding secrets in their grain and their notches and the earth around their bases, waiting for someone desperate enough to dig, stubborn enough to keep digging, and Dawson enough to understand that what they found wasn't treasure but testimony. And testimony, Clara was learning, was worth more than anyone who didn't need it could possibly understand. The courthouse in Dalton had been built in 1952, replacing the one that had burned in 1901, which Clara now understood had been arson rather than accident, a fire set to destroy Ezekiel's original survey records so that Judge Whitfield's forgeries could stand unchallenged. The replacement building was constructed with federal funds and local limestone, solid and square, and designed to project the particular authority that institutions built for justice require, even when the justice they dispensed was imperfect. Clara stood on its steps on a May morning that smelled like magnolia and cut grass, wearing the only blazer she owned, a thrift store find she'd bought for a job interview 3 years ago that she hadn't gotten. Jonah stood beside her in khakis and a button-down shirt he'd ironed himself with the meticulous attention he brought to everything that mattered. Willa wore a dress that Martha Okafor had sewn for her from fabric Willa chose herself, blue with small white flowers, because she said it looked like the wild flowers growing around the corner markers, and she wanted them represented in the courtroom. Behind them, arranged on the courthouse steps and spilling onto the lawn, stood the descendant families. 24 of the original 31, some having traveled from as far as Florida and Virginia, carrying the faces and names and accumulated generations of people who'd been told their ancestors were failures and were about to learn that their ancestors had been robbed. Thomas Henderson wore a suit that smelled of mothballs and memory, his grandfather's homestead receipt folded in his breast pocket like a talisman against the lie he'd lived with for 67 years. Delia Washington stood with her 3 daughters, each wearing a small pin shaped like a fence post that Willa had designed and Frank Espinoza had fabricated from copper wire at his hardware store. Marco Clementi brought his mother, 91 and using a walker, but refusing to miss the moment when her family's story changed from one of failure to one of theft survived. Anna Nguyen arrived last, carrying a framed photograph of her grandparents standing beside their homestead marker in 1894, 2 Vietnamese immigrants who'd crossed oceans for a promise that a Georgia judge had broken before they'd had time to learn enough English to fight back. She placed the photograph on the courthouse steps facing the entrance, as though her grandparents were watching the doors through which justice might finally walk. James Okonkwo met them inside, his presence anchoring the legal proceedings with the authority of someone who'd spent 27 years preparing for cases exactly like this one. Ruth Hadley managed logistics with the quiet efficiency that made her indispensable, ensuring that documents were organized, witnesses prepared, and the emotional temperature of 24 families contained within the boundaries that courtroom decorum required. The Whitfields arrived in formation. Gerald in a charcoal suit that cost more than Clara's car. Travis beside him, polo shirt replaced by similar charcoal, the family presenting unified wealth against the accusation that wealth was built on crime. Margaret Chun led a team of 7 attorneys, their combined presence designed to communicate that the Whitfield defense had resources the plaintiffs couldn't match, even if those resources were defending the indefensible. Judge Patricia Moreno presided, appointed rather than elected, which James had noted was significant because appointed judges faced less political pressure from wealthy donors. She was 58 with reading glasses she wore on a chain around her neck and eyes that suggested she'd seen enough of human nature to be surprised by very little, but disappointed by most of it. The hearing wasn't a trial, not yet. It was a preliminary proceeding to determine whether the plaintiff's claims had sufficient merit to advance to full litigation, whether the evidence was authentic, whether the descendant families had legal standing, whether century-old fraud could be adjudicated under current law. But everyone in the courtroom understood that this hearing would determine the trajectory of everything that followed. If the judge found merit, the Whitfields faced exposure that could destroy their empire. If she didn't, the evidence would be relegated to historical curiosity, and the fence posts would return to being just fence posts. James presented the case with the structured precision of someone who understood that overwhelming evidence could be as dangerous as insufficient evidence if it wasn't organized into a narrative the court could follow. He began with Ezekiel. Your Honor, in 1893, the state of Georgia commissioned Ezekiel Dawson to survey and mark 17,200 acres of public land designated for homestead distribution to 31 families. Mr. Dawson completed this survey with documented precision that modern GPS analysis confirms to within 3.7 inches across the entire grid. His work was the foundation upon which these families built their claims, their homes, and their futures. He placed the original survey plat on the overhead projector, the hand-drawn lines glowing on the courtroom screen with the precision that had survived underground for over a century. Between 1899 and 1903, Judge Harlan Whitfield, acting through the county clerk, systematically altered these survey records, reducing each homestead claim by between 40 and 60% and reassigning the surplus acreage to his own holdings. The evidence of this fraud was preserved by Mr. Dawson beneath each corner marker he'd placed, protected against the elements and against the courthouse fire of 1901, which we now know was set specifically to destroy the original records that would have contradicted the forged ones. Margaret Chun objected to the characterization of the fire as arson, but James was already moving to Ezekiel's journal, reading entries that documented the county clerk's death under suspicious circumstances, the threats Ezekiel received, and the systematic destruction of his professional reputation by a judge who controlled the legal system meant to hear complaints against him. The journal entries fell into the courtroom like stones dropped into still water, each one creating ripples that expanded outward through the assembled families, through the attorneys, through Judge Moreno's carefully maintained neutrality. Clara watched the judge's face as James read the entry about James Henderson losing 190 acres for $11 and saw something shift behind the professional composure, a tightening around the mouth that might have been anger or might have been the particular pain that comes from hearing about injustice committed by the institution you've sworn to serve. The document authentication expert from Emory testified for 2 hours, walking the court through carbon dating results, ink analysis, paper composition, and handwriting verification that collectively established the document's authenticity beyond reasonable scientific challenge. The forensic surveyor followed, presenting GPS data showing that Ezekiel's corner markers matched his original survey plat with accuracy that would have been exceptional even by modern standards. But it was the fence post testimony that transformed the hearing from legal proceeding to something closer to revelation. James called Dr. Sarah Blackwell, a historical cryptography specialist from Georgia Tech who'd spent 3 weeks analyzing the notch patterns Ezekiel had carved into his corner markers. Dr. Blackwell stood at the screen with the controlled excitement of an academic who'd discovered something that challenged her professional assumptions about what was possible with 19th century technology. She displayed enlarged photographs of the notch patterns, each one annotated with the data she'd decoded. Mr. Dawson developed a positional encoding system using variable depth notches carved at specific intervals around each post. She pointed to a series of cuts on the northwest corner marker. This sequence encodes the latitude and longitude of this marker's position using a base 12 numerical system derived from the surveyor's chain measurements standard in that era. The depth of each notch represents a digit. The spacing between notches indicates the decimal position. The face of the post on which the notch appears corresponds to the cardinal direction of the measurement. She paused, letting the courtroom absorb the implications. What Mr. Dawson created was essentially a physical database. Every corner marker contains the complete survey data for its position, encoded in a format that couldn't be altered without physically recarving the posts. And the cedar he selected has a natural resistance to decay that has preserved these carvings for over 130 years. Even if every paper document had been destroyed, the survey could be reconstructed entirely from the posts themselves. Margaret Chun attempted to challenge the interpretation, suggesting that notch patterns could be coincidental damage from weather or wildlife. Dr. Blackwell responded with the devastating patience of someone who'd anticipated the objection. I decoded the data from 23 posts independently and compared the results to Mr. Dawson's original survey plat. Every position matched within the margin of error for hand-carved encoding. The probability of that occurring by chance is approximately 1 in 400 trillion. These patterns are intentional, systematic, and mathematically consistent. The courtroom was silent for a moment that felt longer than its actual duration, the kind of silence that occurs when understanding arrives collectively and the weight of it requires a moment to distribute across everyone present. Gerald Whitfield's face had gone the color of old paper. Travis stared at the screen showing the decoded notch patterns as though willing them to rearrange into something less damning. Margaret Chun conferred with her team in whispers that carried the urgent frequency of people revising strategies in real time. James called the descendant families next. Not all 24. The court's time wouldn't allow it, but 5 representatives chosen to illustrate the human cost of a fraud that legal documents alone couldn't fully convey. Thomas Henderson took the stand with the careful dignity of a man who'd spent 67 years believing a lie about his family and was about to replace it with truth. He held his grandfather's photograph in hands that trembled but didn't drop it. My father told me we came from people who couldn't hold on to what they had. His voice filled the courtroom with the particular resonance of someone who'd carried shame long enough to know its exact weight. I grew up believing my grandfather was a failure. I told my children the same story. 3 generations of Hendersons thinking we came from nothing because a judge stole everything and made it look like our fault. He placed the photograph on the witness stand, his grandfather's face looking out at the courtroom with the expression of a man who'd believed in promises. My grandfather wasn't a failure. He was a victim of people who had more power than conscience. I'm 67 years old, and I'm just now learning that. That's what this case is about. Not money, not property, but the truth about who our families really were. Delia Washington spoke about her great-grandmother's 320 acres, now the site of Whitfield's processing facility, a building that generated approximately $2 million in annual revenue from land that had been seized through forged documents. I drive past that facility every day on my way to work. She spoke with the controlled fury of someone who'd been processing rage since learning the truth. I work as a cashier at the grocery store, making $13 an hour. And every day I drive past a building sitting on my family's stolen land, generating more money in a week than I make in a year. That's not bad luck. That's not my family's failure. That's theft. And the people who committed it have been profiting from it for 125 years. Anna and Gwen told a story that resonated beyond the specific fraud. My grandparents came to this country because they were told that in America, the government keeps its promises. They filed their homestead claim in 1894 with money they'd saved for 3 years working in a San Francisco laundry. They received 400 acres. Within 6 years, they had 210. They never understood why. They spoke limited English, and the legal system was conducted entirely in a language they couldn't fully navigate. They spent the rest of their lives believing they'd made a mistake on the paperwork. She paused, composing herself with the particular effort of someone whose emotion was justified but whose dignity required management. They didn't make a mistake. Someone made a decision that their vulnerability was an opportunity. That's not something you get over in one generation. That's something that changes how a family sees itself forever. The Whitfield defense, when it came, felt thin against the accumulated weight of testimony and evidence. Margaret Chun argued procedural grounds, statutes of limitation, latches, the impracticality of unwinding a century of property transactions. She was technically competent and emotionally overmatched, building legal arguments against a moral tide that the evidence had created and the testimony had amplified. Gerald Whitfield did not testify. Margaret Chun explained that her client would exercise his right not to speak at a preliminary hearing, which was legally sound but optically devastating. The man whose family had benefited from a century of fraud sat silent, while the families his grandfather had victimized told stories that made his silence sound like confession. Judge Moreno took 3 days to issue her ruling. During that time, Clara existed in a state of suspended animation that felt familiar because poverty had trained her to wait for verdicts, for approvals, for the decisions of people with power over her circumstances. But this waiting felt different, charged with the particular energy that comes from knowing that, whatever the ruling, the truth was already loose in the world and couldn't be recaptured. She spent those 3 days walking the fence line, not with Opal's methodical purpose, but with the wandering contemplation of someone who was beginning to understand what these posts meant beyond their legal significance. They were the physical manifestation of one man's refusal to accept that corruption was permanent. Ezekiel had driven them into the ground knowing that his professional reputation was already destroyed, that no court in his lifetime would hear his testimony, that the system designed to protect property rights had been captured by the man stealing property. He'd done it anyway. Not because he expected to win in his generation, but because he believed that permanence was its own argument and that someday someone would care enough to translate it. Opal had understood this. She'd walked these lines not as exercise or eccentricity, but as maintenance of a legacy that required physical tending to survive. Each visit, each inspection, each notch checked and post-verified was an act of faith disguised as routine, the kind of devotion that looked like obsession from outside, but felt like responsibility from within. Clara ran her hand along the northwest corner marker, the first one she'd excavated, feeling the notches beneath her fingers. Grooves carved by hands that had been dead for over a century, but whose work remained, encoding truth in Cedar with the patient confidence of someone who understood that some messages needed to be written in materials that outlasted the liars. The ruling came on a Friday. James called at 4 in the afternoon, his voice carrying the particular vibration that significant news produced in people trained to deliver it calmly. Judge Moreno has ruled in our favor on all preliminary matters. The claims will proceed to full litigation. She's found sufficient evidence of fraud, sufficient standing for all 24 descendant families, and has issued a preservation order covering all fence posts and corner markers across the entire 17,000-acre grid, including those on Whitfield property. Clara sat down on the kitchen floor because her legs decided independently that standing was no longer sustainable. The phone pressed against her ear, James's voice continuing to deliver details that arrived as sound but required minutes to organize into meaning. She's also referred the matter to the Georgia Attorney General's office for investigation of potential criminal liability. That means the state will conduct its own investigation independent of our civil claims. And she used language in her ruling that suggests she found the evidence not just sufficient but compelling. What language? James paused, and Clara heard him reading from the document. The court finds that the evidence presented, including authenticated original survey documents, contemporaneous journal entries, forensic analysis of physical markers, and the notch-encoded survey data preserved in corner posts maintained by successive generations of the Dawson family, establishes a prima facie case of systematic land fraud of extraordinary scope and duration. The court further finds that the defendant family's apparent attempts to suppress this evidence, including the documented trespassing incident at the plaintiff's property, suggest consciousness of guilt that weighs against any claim of innocent acquisition. Clara pressed her palm against the kitchen floor, feeling the solidity of the house Opal had maintained for 63 years. The house that everyone said was worthless. The house that was built on land that held the truth beneath its surface, waiting for someone who needed it badly enough to dig. The settlement negotiations began 2 weeks later, initiated by the Whitfield side through channels that suggested Gerald had finally consulted advisors who told him what Margaretchen apparently couldn't, that fighting this case to trial would mean every document, every journal entry, every decoded fence post becoming part of the permanent public record, accessible to journalists, historians, and the descendant families of every person Judge Whitfield had victimized across his entire career. Not just the 31 Homestead families, but potentially hundreds of others whose claims had passed through his corrupted court. The first offer was insulting. $8 million to be divided among 24 families, with a confidentiality agreement that would seal the evidence and prevent public discussion of the fraud. James rejected it within the hour. The second offer came 3 days later. $14 million, plus return of 2,000 acres of undeveloped Whitfield land to descendant families, still with confidentiality requirements. James brought it to Clara and the families during a meeting at Pastor Willis's church, the only space large enough to hold everyone. The families debated for 4 hours, voices rising and falling as financial need collided with the desire for public acknowledgement that their ancestors had been wronged. Thomas Henderson spoke for many when he stood and addressed the room with the quiet authority of a man who'd finally located the source of a pain he'd been carrying his entire life. I didn't come here for money. Money helps, Lord knows it helps, but I came here because my grandfather deserved better than the story I was told about him. He deserved to have his name cleared and the truth spoken out loud where people could hear it. If we take their money and sign their silence agreement, we get checks. But our families stay failures in the public record. The fraud stays hidden. And the next family they cheat, and there will be a next family, won't have our example to follow. The room's response was unanimous. No confidentiality. No silence. Whatever settlement they accepted would include public acknowledgement of the fraud, official correction of the survey records, and a ceremony where the Whitfield family stated, on the record, what their predecessor had done and what it had cost. James communicated these terms to Margaret Shun, who communicated them to Gerald, who apparently required a weekend of private reckoning before responding. The response came Monday morning. Gerald requested a meeting. Not attorneys. Not formal negotiation. He wanted to speak directly with Clara, at her property, with his son present. Just family, he said, as though the word hadn't been weaponized by his grandfather to mean people worth protecting versus people worth stealing from. Clara agreed, against James's professional advice, but in accordance with an instinct she couldn't fully articulate. Something in Gerald's voice had shifted, a quality she recognized from her own experience of confronting truths you'd spent a lifetime avoiding. The particular sound of a foundation cracking under weight it was never designed to bear. Gerald and Travis arrived at the Dawson property on a Tuesday afternoon that felt weighted with the significance both families understood they were carrying. The magnolias were blooming, their waxy white flowers filling the air with sweetness that seemed incongruous with the gravity of the conversation ahead. The fence posts stood in their lines, visible from the porch where Clara waited, dark cedar markers encoding the truth that had brought everyone to this moment. Gerald stepped out of his truck slowly, the way people move when they're approaching something they've been running from. Travis followed, his face carrying an expression Clara hadn't seen before. Not the arrogant entitlement she'd encountered during their first visit, but something rawer and more uncertain, the look of a man whose identity was being dismantled and who hadn't yet found anything to replace it. Jonah stood at Clara's shoulder, protective presence that had become reflexive. Willis sat on the porch steps with her sketchbook, drawing the scene with the documentary instinct that made her work feel less like art and more like testimony. Gerald stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked at Clara with eyes that had lost the practiced warmth she remembered from their first meeting. What remained was tired and stripped and honest in the way that defeat sometimes forced people to be. I need to tell you something before we discuss terms. His voice carried the weight of words he'd been rehearsing and dreading in equal measure. I knew. Not everything. Not the details your documents revealed, but I knew the land wasn't entirely ours. My father told me when I was 25 and took over operations. He said my grandfather had acquired some properties through aggressive methods, and that certain historical records had been managed to protect the family's interests. He used those words exactly. Managed. As though stealing from 31 families was a filing discrepancy. Travis's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Clara watched him processing his father's confession in real time, understanding that the truth Gerald had hidden from the world, he'd also hidden from his own son. Gerald continued, his words coming faster now, propelled by the momentum of a dam breaking. I told myself it was ancient history, that whatever happened in the 1890s didn't matter anymore, because the world had moved on and the families had moved on and the land was ours in every way that mattered legally. I maintained the records my father maintained. I expanded operations on property I knew was questionable. I paid taxes and employed people and told myself that productivity justified acquisition. He looked at the fence posts. And every year your grandmother walked those lines. And every year I watched her. And every year I told myself she was just a crazy old woman who couldn't let go of the past. But I knew. Some part of me always knew she was keeping watch over something that mattered more than my convenience. The admission settled into the afternoon like smoke, visible and acrid and impossible to ignore. Clara felt something shift in her assessment of the man standing below her. Not forgiveness exactly. That seemed premature and perhaps presumptuous, but recognition. He was not the villain the story seemed to require. He was something more complicated and more human. A man who'd inherited privilege he hadn't earned and made the choice that privilege made easy, the choice to not look too closely at its origins. What are you willing to do about it? Clara's voice carried no anger, which surprised her. The anger was still there, but it had been transformed by weeks of holding evidence and hearing stories and understanding that the damage was too deep and too wide to be addressed by rage alone. Gerald reached into his jacket and produced a folder. Inside were documents his attorneys had prepared, but which bore his handwriting in the margins, corrections and additions that suggested he'd edited the legal language to include something the lawyers hadn't been willing to write. Full restitution of 14,200 acres to the descendant families, proportional to the original homestead allocations documented in Mr. Dawson's survey. For families who prefer financial compensation to property, fair market value at current assessment plus accumulated timber revenue dating back to original seizure, calculated with interest. His voice caught on the next item, the one that cost the most because it cost something that couldn't be measured in dollars. Public ceremony at the courthouse. Full acknowledgement of the fraud committed by Harlan Whitfield. Personal apology from me and from Travis to every descendant family. Correction of official survey records to reflect Mr. Dawson's original plat. And establishment of the Dawson-Whitfield Community Land Trust, funded by Whitfield Timber, to provide housing and agricultural support to affected families in perpetuity. Clara took the folder and read its contents carefully, finding in the legal language the specific commitments that would bind the Whitfield family to accountability that survived Gerald's personal contrition. The numbers were significant. 14,000 acres returned. $31 million in compensation for families choosing financial settlement. $5 million in trust fund endowment. The total cost to Whitfield Timber was approximately 60% of their net worth, enough to force a fundamental restructuring of the company without destroying it entirely. She looked up from the documents. Why now? You've known for decades. Why agree to this now instead of fighting us in court for years? Gerald glanced at Travis, then at the fence posts, then at Willa, who was sketching his face with the unflinching accuracy of someone who drew what she saw rather than what people wanted to be seen. Because your daughter is drawing my portrait, and it will outlast me. Because your son calculated the exact value of what my family stole, and the math doesn't lie. Because your grandmother spent 63 years walking those fence lines, and she deserved to see this moment, and I made sure she didn't by pretending she was irrelevant. He paused, and when he spoke again his voice was barely audible. And because my granddaughter is 8 years old, and I don't want her to inherit what I inherited. The knowledge that everything you have belongs to someone else, and you chose comfort over honesty. Travis spoke for the first time, his voice rough with something between anger and grief. You could have told me. All those years working beside you, expanding operations, planning developments on land that wasn't ours. You let me build my career on a lie. Gerald's face crumpled briefly before he reassembled it. I told myself the same thing my father told himself. That time made it ours. That productivity justified theft. That the families had moved on. He looked at his son with the naked vulnerability of a parent who has failed and knows it and can't undo it. I was wrong. I was. Always wrong. I just didn't have the courage to be right until someone dug up the proof and made cowardice more expensive than honesty. Clara descended the porch steps and stood before Gerald Whitfield, holding the folder that contained the terms of his family's surrender. She thought about Ezekiel driving posts in a clay with a compass and a chain. About Opal walking her lines for 63 years in every weather. About 31 families whose grandchildren still carried the weight of being told they came from failure. About Willa sketching the truth and Jonah calculating it, and both of them learning that inheritance meant responsibility to people you'd never met, but whose suffering had shaped the world you lived in. I'll take this to the families. They decide. Not me, not my lawyer, not you. The people who were harmed decide what justice looks like. Gerald nodded. That's fair. Clara extended her hand. Not in friendship or forgiveness, but but an acknowledgement that the conversation had been honest, and that honesty, even when it arrived decades late, still carried weight. Gerald shook it with the grip of a man who understood that he was letting go of something he'd held too long, and that his hands would feel different afterward. The descendant families met at Pastor Willis's church for the final time 3 days later. Clara presented Gerald's offer with the clinical precision James had taught her, separating emotional satisfaction from practical analysis. The families deliberated for 6 hours, the longest and most significant discussion most of them had ever participated in, voices rising and falling as 24 families who'd been strangers before this process became a community through shared experience of injustice acknowledged. The vote was unanimous. They accepted the terms with 3 additions. First, the public ceremony would include reading the names of all 31 original homestead families, not just the 24 who'd been located, because the 7 who couldn't be found deserved acknowledgement even in absence. Second, the Dawson fence posts would be designated as a Georgia State Historic Landmark, protected in perpetuity as evidence of both the fraud they documented and the resistance they represented. Third, the ceremony would take place not at the courthouse but on the Dawson property, among the fence posts themselves, because the truth had been preserved there, and that was where it should be spoken. The ceremony happened on a Saturday in June, when Georgia's summer was asserting itself with the particular authority of heat that didn't negotiate. They gathered on the Dawson property at dawn, before the temperature made standing outdoors an act of endurance, assembling among the fence posts that Ezekiel had placed and Opal had maintained and Clara had excavated, and the whole world now recognized as something other than an old woman's obsession. 312 people attended, 24 descendant families with their extended networks, community members from Dalton and surrounding counties, James Okonkwo's legal team, Sandra Kim from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution with a camera crew, Martha Okafor's high school students, who'd researched the 31 families and created a documentary that would win regional awards and become required viewing in Georgia history classes, Frank Espinoza, who'd built a small stage near the northwest corner marker and refused to let anyone else do the electrical work, Deputy Maria Esperanza in civilian clothes, standing near the back with the alertness of someone who attended both as community member and as witness to justice she'd helped protect. Gerald and Travis Whitfield stood at the front, facing the assembled families with the particular posture of people who'd chosen to be present for something painful because absence would have been worse. Clara spoke first because the families had asked her to, not as spokesperson but as the woman who'd started digging when everyone told her the posts were worthless. My grandmother Opal Dawson walked this fence line every week for 63 years. She spoke without notes, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd with clarity that surprised her. People called her crazy. They called her obsessed. They called her a lonely old woman who'd lost her mind to isolation and stubbornness. She paused, looking at the fence posts surrounding them, dark cedar markers standing in their lines like witnesses who'd been waiting over a century to be called. She wasn't crazy. She was keeping a promise. A promise her father made to 31 families when he drove these posts into the ground, that the truth would survive even when the systems meant to protect it were corrupted, even when the people meant to enforce it were purchased, even when the evidence was buried underground and the woman guarding it was dismissed as irrelevant. She turned to the descendant families. Your ancestors weren't failures. They were farmers and immigrants and dreamers who came to this place because they were promised something, and that promise was broken by people with power and without conscience. The shame you carried, the stories you were told about coming from nothing, those stories were lies. You came from people who worked and hoped and deserved better. Today we correct the record. Gerald Whitfield approached the microphone with the deliberate steps of a man walking toward something he couldn't retreat from. His prepared statement was in his pocket, but when he reached the front, he left it there and spoke instead from the place where preparation gave way to truth. My name is Gerald Whitfield. My great-grandfather was Harlan Whitfield, and in 1899 he began stealing land from 31 families through forged survey documents, a corrupt county clerk, and the power of a judicial office he used as a weapon against people who couldn't defend themselves. He stole their property. He destroyed the evidence. He ruined the reputation of the surveyor who tried to stop him, and he built a fortune that my family has enjoyed for 4 generations while the families he victimized struggled with poverty and shame that was never their fault. His voice broke. He didn't try to fix it. The break was the most honest sound he'd made in decades. I knew. Not everything. Not for my whole life. But for long enough that my silence makes me complicit. I watched Opal Dawson walk these fence lines and told myself she was crazy because believing that was easier than acknowledging what she was really doing. Protecting the truth that my family spent a century trying to bury. He faced the descendant families directly. I'm sorry. Not because a court ordered me to be, and not because the evidence left me no choice, but because I should have said this years ago and lacked the courage. Your families were robbed. My family was the robber. No amount of money or property return fully repairs that. But I hope the actions we're taking today demonstrate that the Whitfield family is finally choosing honesty over comfort. Travis followed his father, shorter in words, but no less significant. I built my career on stolen ground. I didn't know, but ignorance isn't innocence when the knowledge was available and I chose not to look. I'm 36 years old and I'm starting over. Not from nothing. I still have more than most, but from a place where I know exactly what my family's wealth cost other families. I'll spend the rest of my life making sure that debt gets paid. Thomas Henderson was invited to respond on behalf of the descendant families. He stood slowly, his 67 years visible in joints that protested the effort, but invisible in the voice that filled the morning air. My grandfather James Henderson filed his homestead claim in 1894. He was promised 480 acres. He received 290 after a judge decided his property was worth stealing. Thomas held up the photograph of his grandfather, the tintype image Clara had excavated from the southeast corner marker. He died believing he was a failure. My father believed it too. I believed it until 3 months ago when a woman I'd never met dug up a fence post and found the truth buried underneath. His voice filled with decades of released weight. I'm 67 years old. I have children and grandchildren who grew up with the same story I did, that we came from people who couldn't make it work. Today I get to tell them a different story, that we came from people who were robbed by powerful men and survived anyway. That's not a story of failure. That's a story of endurance. And it took a surveyor's fence posts and a stubborn grandmother and a single mother with 2 kids and $17 to bring it to light. He turned to Clara. You inherited fence posts. Everyone said they were worthless. Turns out they were the most valuable things in this county. Not because of what they were made of, but because of what they remembered. The property transfers and financial distributions took months to finalize through legal processes that James navigated with the methodical patience the system required. But the ceremony accomplished something the legal system couldn't. It transformed family stories. It replaced shame with truth. It gave 24 families permission to see themselves differently and to tell their children a different narrative about who they were and where they came from. 14,200 acres returned to descendant families through a process that James designed to be as painless as the complexity allowed. Some families took their land and began farming it, returning to the agricultural purpose their ancestors had intended. Others sold portions to fund education, healthcare, and the particular necessities that generational poverty accumulates into crushing weight. The financial settlements totaled $31 million. Distributed proportionally based on original homestead size and adjusted for the accumulated timber revenue the Whitfields had generated from stolen property. Thomas Henderson's share was $2.3 million. He used a portion to establish a scholarship fund at the local high school in his grandfather's name, providing educational opportunity to students whose families had experienced land theft or housing insecurity. The rest went to his children and grandchildren with a single instruction. Remember where this came from. Not from luck and not from charity. From a surveyor named Ezekiel Dawson who loved the truth enough to carve it into cedar and bury it underground and trust that someday someone would care enough to dig. Delia Washington received the 320 acres where Whitfield's processing facility stood. She chose to lease it back to the company at fair market rate, using the income to support her family while the facility continued employing local workers. The arrangement demonstrated something the Whitfields hadn't expected, that justice didn't require destruction, that the families they'd stolen from were capable of the generosity that the Whitfields themselves had never shown. Ann and Wynn's family received $2.1 million and 400 acres of restored property. She planted rice on a portion of the land, the first rice cultivation in northwest Georgia, honoring her grandparents' agricultural heritage while creating something new. The rest became a community garden open to anyone who needed food, which in rural Georgia meant nearly everyone at some point or another. Marco Clementi's 91-year-old mother, Isabella, insisted on visiting the original homestead site before the property transfer was complete. She walked the boundary lines with a cane in one hand and her grandson's arm in the other, touching the fence posts the way someone touches a headstone, with the reverence reserved for objects that represent people who can no longer speak for themselves. When she reached the corner marker where Clara had found the photograph of her father as a young man standing beside his homestead claim, she pressed both hands against the cedar and spoke in Italian, a prayer or a promise or a combination of both that no one translated because its meaning was clear in any language. She died 3 weeks later in her sleep, and her family said she'd been waiting for this, that the unfinished business of her father's stolen land had been keeping her here, and once it was resolved, she'd finally given herself permission to rest. The 7 families who couldn't be located through conventional research became a project that connected the case to communities far beyond Northwest Georgia. James's paralegal team worked with genealogical databases, historical societies, and immigrant community organizations to trace descendants who'd scattered across the country in the decades after their ancestors' land was stolen. By the following spring, they'd found 5 of the 7. A family in Detroit whose great-grandmother had walked away from her reduced homestead in 1907, taking nothing but her children and a bitterness she never fully explained to them. A family in Los Angeles whose ancestor had been one of the few black homesteaders in the original 31, a man named Solomon Carter who'd served in the military and earned his land through service and had it taken through corruption that carried the additional cruelty of racial targeting. His great-granddaughter, Vanessa Carter, was a civil rights attorney in Pasadena who flew to Georgia within 48 hours of receiving Ruth's call and stood on the land her great-grandfather had been promised, crying with the particular intensity of someone who understood exactly what had been stolen because she'd spent her career fighting the systems that enabled such theft. The 2 families who were never found received their share of the settlement through a trust that James established, holding the funds and the property in escrow against the possibility that someday a descendant would appear with a story about an ancestor who'd lost everything in Georgia and never understood why. The trust was structured to last 100 years, matching the duration of the fraud it was designed to remedy, because James understood that justice moved on its own timeline and that some debts required patience that exceeded individual lifetimes. Travis Whitfield's transformation surprised everyone, perhaps most of all Travis himself. He resigned from Whitfield Timbers Board within a week of the ceremony and enrolled in an environmental science program at the University of Georgia, trading inherited authority for earned knowledge with the focused determination of someone rebuilding an identity from materials he'd chosen rather than inherited. He returned to Dalton on weekends, working with the Land Trust as a volunteer, learning forestry from the perspective of stewardship rather than extraction. His relationship with his father remained complicated, the particular tension that exists between a man who knew a shameful truth and the son he'd kept it from. But they walked the Dawson fence line together one October morning, and Gerald told him the full story of what his great-grandfather had done, holding nothing back. And Travis listened with the stillness of someone who understood that the weight his father was finally sharing had been crushing him for decades. Gerald himself appeared at Thomas Henderson's scholarship ceremony that fall, sitting in the back row of the high school auditorium while Thomas presented the first 4 recipients with checks that bore the Henderson name and the Whitfield funding. When Thomas invited him to stand and be recognized, Gerald rose slowly and said only 3 words: "I'm deeply sorry." The applause that followed was complicated, mixing acknowledgement with reservation, forgiveness with wariness, but it was real, and Gerald accepted it with the humility of a man who understood that some debts could be serviced but never fully repaid. The ripple effects expanded through the county and beyond. Other families in neighboring districts began examining their own property histories, comparing deed records against physical markers and family stories that had always carried an undercurrent of something unresolved. Ruth Hadley's office received 23 inquiries within 3 months of the ceremony, each one a potential thread in a larger tapestry of historical land fraud that the Dawson case had illuminated but not exhausted. James expanded the Appalachian Justice Project's Property Fraud Division, hiring 2 additional attorneys and a full-time researcher whose sole focus was identifying patterns of historical dispossession across the rural South. Clara's transformation happened not in a single moment, but in the accumulated weight of moments that built upon each other until the woman standing among the fence posts bore only superficial resemblance to the woman who'd arrived with garbage bags and $17. The Dawson property was designated a Georgia State Historic Landmark, the fence posts protected by law and maintained through the Dawson-Whitfield Community Land Trust that Gerald's settlement had established. Clara was appointed the trust's first executive director, a position that paid enough to end the particular mathematics of survival that had governed her life for 6 years. She used the income to repair the house that Opal had maintained with fierce independence and diminishing resources, replacing roof shingles not one at a time, but all at once, fixing the foundation crack that Jonah had documented on their first day, upgrading the kitchen with appliances that belonged to the current century, while keeping the walnut table that had held the evidence and the cast-iron pans that had fed Opal through 63 winters. Jonah enrolled at the county school where Martha Okafor taught history, finding in her classroom the particular combination of intellectual challenge and emotional support that his mathematical mind had been craving. His geometry skills expanded into trigonometry and calculus, and Martha connected him with a summer program at Georgia Tech, where he spent 2 weeks learning that the precision Ezekiel had applied to surveying could also be applied to engineering and architecture and the kinds of building that created rather than destroyed. Willa's sketches of the fence posts and the descendant families became the foundation of a traveling exhibition that Martha organized through the school district. 37 drawings documenting the fraud, the evidence, the families, and the resolution, displayed in schools across Northwest Georgia with accompanying curriculum materials that Martha developed to teach students about property rights, historical justice, and the difference between legal and moral. The exhibition's opening night at the county library drew over 200 visitors, families who'd been part of the case standing beside their portraits while strangers read the accompanying stories and understood for the first time how much history could be hidden inside something as simple as a fence post. An elderly man from Chatsworth stood in front of the Henderson portrait for 20 minutes without speaking, then found Thomas Henderson in the crowd and told him that he'd been James Henderson's neighbor as a child and had always wondered why such a hard-working man seemed to carry sadness like a second skin. Now he understood. The shame of being stolen from was different from the shame of failing, but it looked the same from the outside, and it destroyed the same number of lives. The exhibition traveled to the Georgia State Capitol in Atlanta, where it hung in the rotunda for a month while legislators debated the Dawson Heritage Protection Act, a bill inspired by the case that strengthened protections for historical survey markers and created new legal mechanisms for challenging fraudulent land transfers regardless of their age. The bill passed with bipartisan support, signed by the governor at a ceremony where Clara stood beside Thomas Henderson and Anna Nguyen and Delia Washington, women and men whose families had waited over a century for acknowledgement that what happened to them was wrong and that the system was capable, however belatedly, of correction. Frank Espinoza closed his hardware store on the day of the signing ceremony and drove to Atlanta to watch, bringing with him a fence post he'd carved from cedar using techniques Ezekiel had developed, a replica of the northwest corner marker complete with encoded notch patterns that spelled out a message Dr. Blackwell had helped him design. The message read, "Truth endures," in the base 12 system Ezekiel had invented, and Frank presented it to Clara as a gift that she placed on her porch beside the rocking chair where she'd first read Opal's letter. Deputy Maria Esperanza was promoted to investigator and assigned to a newly created unit focused on historical property fraud across Northwest Georgia. Her first case involved a family in Murray County whose land had been seized through a similar mechanism in 1912, and she contacted Clara for guidance on how to investigate claims that crossed centuries. Sandra Kim's reporting on the Dawson case won a regional journalism award and led to a national investigation into historical land theft patterns across the American South. Her series documented similar fraud in 7 states, affecting an estimated 12,000 families whose homestead claims had been reduced or eliminated through corrupt officials and forged documents. The series prompted congressional hearings and the introduction of federal legislation extending property fraud protections. On the anniversary of their arrival at the Dawson property, Clara walked the fence line at dawn, not with Opal's methodical purpose. Exactly, though she checked each post and verified each notch the way her grandmother had taught her through example rather than instruction. She walked with something that felt more like conversation, her footsteps following paths that 4 generations of Dawsons had worn into the Georgia clay, her hands touching posts that Ezekiel had placed with the understanding that some truths needed to be written in materials that outlasted the systems designed to suppress them. Willow walked with her, sketching as she went, documenting the fence line in the golden light of early morning. The posts were being cleaned and maintained now through the land trust, their notch patterns carefully preserved under the supervision of Dr. Blackwell's team from Georgia Tech, who'd established an ongoing research project studying Ezekiel's encoding system as a model for physical data preservation. Jonah met them at the northwest corner marker, the one that had started everything, where a small bronze plaque now read Ezekiel Dawson Survey .1, 1893. Original homestead corner for the Dawson family claim of 412 acres. Maintained by Opal Dawson 1961 through 2024. Evidence preserved herein restored justice to 31 families defrauded through corrupt alteration of official survey records. He stood beside the post with his hands in his pockets, looking at the plaque with an expression that mixed pride with the particular sadness that comes from understanding that some victories arrive too late for the people who earned them. Great-Grandma Opal should be here. His voice was quiet. She is. Clara touched the corner marker, feeling the notches beneath her fingers, the encoded truth that had survived underground for over a century because a man with a compass and a chisel had refused to accept that corruption was permanent. She's in every post, in every notch, in every line she walked for 63 years. She was here before us, and she'll be here after us, because the work she did doesn't stop just because she's gone. Willa looked up from her sketch. Are we going to keep walking the lines? Like Grandma Opal did? Clara looked at the fence posts stretching in their rows across property that was now protected, maintained, and recognized for what it had always been. Not worthless relics of an old woman's obsession, but the most significant historical survey evidence in the state of Georgia. Markers that had preserved truth when every human institution designed to protect it had failed. Cedar posts that had outlasted courthouses, outlasted judges, outlasted 4 generations of lies, standing in their lines with the patient permanence of objects that understood that some responsibilities didn't end when the person carrying them died. Every week, Clara's voice carried certainty that came from somewhere deeper than decision. For as long as there are Dawsons and there are posts, we walk the lines. She thought about Ezekiel carving notches by lamplight, encoding survey data into wood with a system so elegant that it took modern cryptographers weeks to decode. About Opal choosing to be called crazy rather than reveal what she was protecting, trading her reputation for the safety of evidence that mattered more than anyone's opinion of her. About 31 families who'd carried shame for over a century and were now carrying truth instead, a weight that was heavier in some ways, but infinitely more bearable because it was honest. And she thought about herself. Clara Dawson, single mother, veterinary technician, inheritor of fence posts. A woman who'd arrived with garbage bags and $17 and a grandmother's bequest that everyone said was worthless. Who'd dug up a corner marker because a letter told her to and found underneath it the beginning of justice for people she'd never met. Who'd stood on a courthouse porch with descendant families and watched a powerful man admit what his family had done because the evidence carved into cedar was too precise and too permanent to deny. The fence posts had been waiting for someone like her. Not someone special. Not someone powerful. Not someone with resources or connections or the kind of privilege that made fighting easy. Just someone who needed what they offered badly enough to dig. Someone stubborn enough to keep digging when the powerful told her to stop. Someone Dawson enough to understand that the posts weren't worthless at all. They were the most valuable inheritance anyone had ever received. Not because of the money they'd ultimately recovered or the property they'd restored, but because they proved something that Clara had stopped believing during 6 years of poverty and 4 moves and a dripping faucet and an eviction notice on a Tuesday. That the truth survives. That it endures in cedar and notches and the walking of lines by women the world calls crazy. That it waits underground with the patience of something that understands time better than the people who try to bury it. And that someday, always someday, Someone arrives who cares enough to dig it up, to brush off the clay, to read what was written, and to speak it aloud in a voice that carries. Clara Dawson had inherited fence posts. And fence posts, it turned out, remembered everything. The morning sun climbed above the Georgia pines, casting long shadows across the Dawson property, illuminating fence posts that stood in their rows the way they'd stood for over 130 years. Dark cedar against green forest, encoding truth in a language that time couldn't erode and power couldn't silence. And among them walked a woman and her 2 children, checking each post, verifying each notch, maintaining the evidence that had changed their lives and the lives of 31 families who'd been waiting since 1893 for someone to listen to what the wood had been saying all along. The posts remembered. The Dawsons remembered. And now, finally, everyone else would remember too. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.